Councillor mentions is very important as we move forward from this point. We've had 25 years of peace and stability which has flowed from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and its signing. And when we, I'd like to think as we look forward, we not just have peace and stability, but we also have prosperity for the next 25 years.
Secretary of State Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with your important words about PC Keith Palmer. It's been reported that PSNI has requested 330 officers from other UK forces for support during the forthcoming presidential visit from President Biden next month. Can he confirm that his department will continue to work closely with PSNI during this challenging period and anticipate any assistance that they might need?
Yes, we have a number of very big visitors coming to Northern Ireland to mark this very important anniversary. And I know that actually the PSNI are remarkably well organised and preparing for this. And of course, the government will happily support the PSNI in its endeavours.
Peter Kyle.
I'm grateful for his words. PSNI will also need support after Air Force One departs. Due to a funding shortfall, officer numbers will fall soon to a record low. In fact, there will be 800 fewer officers than agreed in New Decade, New Approach. Does the Secretary of State think this is fair for a force that faces unique challenges on a daily basis?
I completely recognise that the PSNI, firstly I'd like to pay tribute to all the officers in the police service of Northern Ireland for all the work they do across communities, to the Chief Constable who has brought in community policing that most of us in this House would be completely cognizant of in our own areas, but is almost new in Northern Ireland. Policing is actually one of those matters, as he well knows, that is devolved to the institutions, the executive in Northern Ireland. I'm well aware of the Chief Constable's asks in this area, and I'm talking to him on those.
Scott Benton.
Question 2, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I encourage the member for Blackpool South, my honourable friend, to attend the debate later today in this chamber, which will focus precisely on the regulations for implementing this powerful democratic mechanism. In very short term, in short, 30 MLAs from 2 political parties may use the break if there's anything significantly different about a new rule, whether in its content or scope, and if its application will have a significant impact specific to everyday life that is liable to persist in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Even if a significant number of MLAs object to proposals from the EU, the decision to veto them will still rest with the UK government, and there would no doubt be an institutional reluctance to use a veto which would be met with retaliatory action from the EU. Given the impact this would likely have on UK-EU relations and wider trade, surely it is very unlikely that the Stormont break will in fact ever be used, even if MLAs want it to be triggered.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and with respect, I think he underestimates the power of this mechanism. The government will be under a legal obligation to trigger the break where the conditions under the Windsor framework were met. Actually, compared with the protocol bill, this is a significant advancement, because the remedial measures that he talks about, should the EU choose to take them, would only be proportionate and would have to be related to NI to EU trade, whereas in the protocol bill it would have been across the piece. No one wants to use this mechanism for trivial reasons, but once triggered, the regulations set out that the government must not agree a rule at the Joint Committee unless there's cross-community support for it in the Assembly, that it does not create regulatory borders within the United Kingdom, or there are exceptional circumstances like Stormont not sitting or a foot-and-mouth outbreak or something of that nature.
Mr. Speaker, and will the Secretary of State agree that rather than an emergency brake, that it's more like a handbrake, which does have the ability to stop a moving car, but rather than potentially or partially slow the vehicle, and that the only brake and accelerator can come from the EU, who retain the complete control over Northern Ireland, and indeed by extension control the will of this House, and they shouldn't, and that is indeed a tragedy and also a travesty.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Essentially, if the Assembly says no to something, the presumption is the government would veto it. But without this measure, Northern Ireland would continue to have full and automatic dynamic alignment with EU goods rules, with no say whatsoever in the Northern Ireland Assembly and no veto on amending and replacing measures. The Stormont break is a very good thing.
Alexander Stafford.
Number 3, sir.
Mr Speaker, the Windsor Framework restores the free flow of trade from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. The agreement guarantees unfettered access for Northern Ireland's businesses to the UK market on a permanent basis, and we have secured an alternative arrangements which remove any proposed requirement to provide export declarations or equivalent information for goods moving from Northern Ireland to Great Britain.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. Rother Valley has many amazing businesses, especially butchers such as G. Lomas in South Anston, Grays of Thurcroft, Stuart Sanders and Maltby, and Lawns Farm in Northern. I want everyone to try their products. What assurances can the Minister give me that everybody, no matter where they are in the United Kingdom, can taste Rother Valley sausage?
I am delighted to confirm to my honourable friend that residents of Northern Ireland will be able to enjoy the sausages produced by the great businesses in his constituency. The framework ends the ban on chilled meats like sausages and seasoned lamb joints, meaning that supermarket shelves in Northern Ireland will be able to stock the products customers want and have had access to for years.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. But the reality is for my constituents and for example, McCartney's Delicatessen in Moira, that whilst they can bring sausages from Yorkshire or from any other part of the United Kingdom that are made to British standards, the sausages they make in Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, have to be made to EU standards because EU law applies for all manufactured goods in Northern Ireland. So why is it right to bring sausages from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and sell them in Northern Ireland, but it's not right to sell British sausages made in Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland?
Well, Mr Speaker, I understand the force and passion with which he makes this point, but he knows that what we've done is reduce the extent of EU law in Northern Ireland to the absolute minimum consistent with keeping open an infrastructure-free border with the Republic of Ireland. And I appreciate that this is a compromise which for many people will go too far, but I believe that it is the right decision in these circumstances.
Can I just say to the member, please take notes of questions. Sir Geoffrey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. But the reality is, Mr Speaker, that Northern Ireland's place within the UK internal market has not been fully restored by the Windsor Framework because EU law applies for all manufactured goods in Northern Ireland, despite the fact that of £77 billion worth of goods manufactured in Northern Ireland, 65 billion are sold in the United Kingdom, and yet all of those goods must comply with EU law regardless of where they are sold. Can't back to the proposals in the protocol bill, which mean that UK law applies unless a business wants to trade with EU, in which case they must follow EU law.
Mr Speaker, on the proposal for dual regulation, that was not what constituent businesses in Northern Ireland wanted. And, you know, at some point, even unrelenting figures like myself do need to compromise and give the voters what they want. But what I would say to him is that I recognise that compromise is extremely difficult. And we are in a position where we've got an opportunity to move forwards together. He knows, as I know, I'm sure, that manufacturing of most of the kind of goods to which he's referring is done to international standards. And so I think in all of the circumstances, this is a reasonable compromise for Northern Ireland.
Teresa Villiers.
Question number 3, Mr Speaker, sir.
Number 4, sir. I think... Mr Speaker, the Northern Ireland economy has the ingredients required for economic success: exceptional talent, creativity, innovation and a healthy spirit of private sector entrepreneurship. Last week the Secretary of State was delighted to visit the United States, and next week I'll be visiting the USA and Canada to promote the excellent investment opportunities in Northern Ireland. We are of course also planning an investment summit.
Teresa Villiers.
One of the ways to attract foreign direct investment is by creating the right regulatory climate. And the Minister has been a very strong advocate for post-Brexit regulatory reform to make our rules more competitive, more targeted, more agile, more modern. So when does he think we'll get to the position where we can do that in Northern Ireland in the same way Brexit allows us to do it in Great Britain?
Of course, she and I have walked a long way in these various battles together, and she knows very well what she asks me. In relation to goods, we do have to make sure we can keep open that infrastructure-free border north-south. But what I would say is that the unique position of Northern Ireland is that on services regulation, Northern Ireland will be subject to UK law and UK trade agreements. So where we have comparative advantage, particularly in Northern Ireland on issues like fintech, they'll be subject to UK law and UK regulation, and they'll have access to global markets through the kind of trade agreements in services which it's in all of our interests to strike to serve the comparative advantage of the whole UK. This is the unique opportunity now facing Northern Ireland. I want us all to seize it in every way we can.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, Northern Ireland now has the highest percentage accessibility for gigabit-capable broadband in the UK, twice that of the Republic of Ireland, and one of the highest in the world. Will he ensure that the energy infrastructure is such to complement this, thereby offering one of the best inward investment and indigenous business opportunities anywhere in the world?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he will know that energy is devolved, and I hope that he will join me in doing everything possible to ensure that the maximum investment can be made in energy in Northern Ireland, and he knows exactly what he and his colleagues need to do to help me to serve him and serve Northern Ireland, and that is, of course, to restore the devolved institutions.
John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that in restoring the balance of the Belfast Agreement, the best way is to pass the Windsor Framework today in this place, that we have to be pragmatic, and we have to open our eyes to the many opportunities, courtesy of inward investment, that will then follow for the benefit of all communities in the province?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with him strongly. The reality is that the Windsor Framework is a dramatic improvement on the protocol. I don't think anyone can reasonably argue otherwise. Of course, it includes compromises. Neither I nor my right honourable friend nor the Prime Minister is suggesting that it doesn't. The question that everyone needs to answer is whether this is a step forward for Northern Ireland. I'm absolutely sure that it is, and I agree with him.
Stephen Farray.
Tourism spending is also very important. The Minister will be aware that the Northern Ireland Tourist Alliance is very concerned about the application of the forthcoming electronic travel authorisation on the sector in Northern Ireland, given our unique marketing and our unique offer. So will the Minister work with the Home Office to try to find a practical solution to this problem?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I'm well aware of the case that he makes, and of course we're in conversation with colleagues from the Home Office. The government's position is that we're determined to make sure that tourists understand that they will need to comply with UK immigration requirements to visit the UK, and that will mean that they will need that travel authorisation to go to Northern Ireland. I am aware of the concerns of tourism authorities, north and south, and indeed the concerns of the Irish government. We continue to take those seriously as we talk with the Home Office.
Spokesperson Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr.
Please. Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Jonathan Haskell, external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, has estimated that Brexit has resulted in the loss of approximately £29 billion of business investment to the UK as a whole. Does the Minister believe that the Windsor Framework will undo that proportion of the damage that has been done to the Northern Irish economy? And if so, why does he consider that the market access that that framework underpins is good enough for one part of the United Kingdom, but not good enough for the rest of us?
Mr. Speaker, I'm honoured that he should think that on the fly I would be able to do my own economic modelling on that subject. But what I would say to him is that it is undoubtedly the case that the political turmoil of the last several years has been unhelpful. But what I would say to him, and it should be a salutary lesson to everybody on his benches, that it is extremely important that when the public vote for a thing, that they get the thing they voted for. And the public voted for the whole UK to stay together, in a once-in-a-generation referendum on Scottish independence, and then the UK as a whole voted to leave the European Union, and that's what we'll deliver.
Well, Fletcher, question number 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend for his question. The Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill, which continues its passage through Parliament, will establish an independent body to conduct reviews into trouble-related deaths and serious injury, with the primary objective of providing information to families, victims and survivors. The legislation seeks to ensure the process for dealing with the past focuses on measures that can deliver positive outcomes for as many people affected by the Troubles as possible.
Well, Fletcher.
Legacy is an extremely complex and sensitive issue. In setting up an effective information recovery process, we must ensure that power is in the hands of victims and families rather than the perpetrators. So what consultations has his department had with victims and their families to ensure the right balance is achieved?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? He's absolutely right that legacy remains a highly complex and difficult issue. And the government's absolutely determined to deliver mechanisms that provide better outcomes for those most affected by the Troubles, including victims and their families. And I know that no solution that we will ever find will be perfect or easy, but we're working tirelessly to find a practical way forward via the Legacy Bill. As for engagement, myself and my ministerial colleagues have had over 60, nearly 70 engagements with groups and individuals concerning this, and we continue to meet people on a regular basis.
Now, the Minister, Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Government has made some changes to the Legacy Bill during its passage in this House. If the changes are not enough and all Northern Ireland parties vote against it again on its return to the House, will the Minister commit to a different approach, as reconciliation cannot be imposed on Northern Ireland?
I thank the honourable gentleman, who I welcome to his place, and I hope the minister, the shadow minister he's replacing, is all is well. And he's got big shoes to fill, so it's a good start. But I thank him for noticing what's going on in the other place, because in the other place we've already tabled amendments that seek to address a number of key issues that have been raised by the stakeholders that we've been meeting, including ECHR compliance, strengthening the Commission's independence, sanctions for individuals found guilty of lying and to the Commission, and creating stronger incentives for individuals to engage with the Commission. And we will be bringing forward more such amendments at report stage, where I hope we can get everybody on board, or at least to acknowledge that we're doing a decent job.
Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the UK Government is steadfastly committed to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the institutions and rights established by it. We recognise the importance of the rights, safeguards and equality of opportunity provisions within the agreement to the people of Northern Ireland, and the Secretary of State discusses the subject regularly with Cabinet colleagues.
Ellie Reeves.
The Good Friday Agreement led to peace in Northern Ireland and enshrined human rights into Northern Irish law. Yet the Tories' Bill of Rights is nothing but a rights removal bill. Does the Minister therefore recognise that the proposed bill would be a breach of an international agreement, the Good Friday Agreement?
No, not at all. I confess I thought she was going to ask me about the Bill of Rights provisions in the agreement itself, but she ought to know that the parties have been working together towards that Bill of Rights, and it will need consensus to deliver a framework in Northern Ireland. But of course the UK continues to be committed to the ECHR.
Martin Day. Martin Day.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions. The Leader of the Opposition knows how much this Parliament likes it when you group questions together. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 7, 10 and 13 together. The Windsor Framework restores the free flow of trade from Great Britain to Northern Ireland through a green lane, guarantees unfettered access to Northern Ireland's businesses to the UK market on a permanent basis, and a whole host of other benefits which we've got.
Thank you. The world's most exciting economic zone is how the Prime Minister described Northern Ireland being in the UK market and having access to the European market. Does the Secretary of State agree with that assessment? And if he does that not mean that the rest of the UK's nations are at a disadvantage, being less exciting, only being part of the UK market?
I thank him for acknowledging what a good deal the Windsor Framework is. And as the Prime Minister has said, Northern Ireland will now be in the unique position of being part of the UK internal market, the 5th biggest market in the world, but also enjoying the EU single market. And as part of the UK, Northern Ireland's businesses and consumers are able to benefit from the new trade agreements we are able to negotiate and the new UK regulatory regime for trade and services that we can do outside of being members of the European Union.
Kirsten Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, by the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister's own admission, Northern Ireland is in a better economic position than the rest of the UK because of its place in the European single market. Now, the Prime Minister also said this would lead to more companies investing in Northern Ireland, and that won't be new money. So if companies are investing more in Northern Ireland, does he see that that means that they'll be investing less in the rest of the UK? Would the Secretary of State see that as a win-win?
And I hadn't even answered the question. I think the Honourable Lady has kind of missed the point. There's a huge amount. Okay, no, she has completely missed the point because there is a huge amount of inward investment that wants to flow into Northern Ireland from outside of these isles. And yes, we should be welcoming inward investment into Northern Ireland because prosperity builds on the peace and stability that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement has brought for the last 25 years, which is why we should all welcome the Windsor Framework.
And then Keza.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scotland, like Northern Ireland, rejected Brexit. Both were dragged out of the EU despite voting Remain. Yet, Northern Ireland has retained access to the EU single market and the economic benefits that it brings. So does the Minister agree that Scotland should have a similar deal to be as economically competitive as Northern Ireland?
I thank you for a question, and with the greatest respect, the positions of Northern Ireland and the other nations of the UK are, as I've said before, not completely comparable. Northern Ireland is undoubtedly a wonderful place, but it has a complex and troubled history, and we've talked about the need and the wonders of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement celebrating its 25th, marking its 25th anniversary. But it also has a land border, the only one between the UK and the EU. That has brought added complications, which the Windsor Framework is in place, and the Windsor Framework is a place to safeguard the achievements of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the hard-won gains of the peace process. It recognises these unique circumstances, including the all-Ireland dimensions of economic life between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and the need to avoid a hard border.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I strongly support the Windsor Framework and welcome the veterinary and SPS measures. Can my right honourable friend update the House on progress towards securing the long-term supply of veterinary medicines in Northern Ireland and also smoothing the safe movement of animals between GB and Northern Ireland to include not only pets but also farm animals and horses?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. He knows a great deal about this subject. As he knows, there is a grace period in place until the end of December 2025 on veterinary medicines. I would like to think that the new atmosphere that has been created between the United Kingdom and the European Union as we move forward has demonstrated that we can talk and negotiate about these things, and we fully expect to be able to be in a position to address all of his concerns in good time.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I'd like to point out that live subtitles and British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings are available to watch on parliamentlive.tv. We start with questions to Prime Minister Joe Gideon.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joe Gideon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow is the National Day of Reflection, a Marie Curie-led initiative bringing together communities across the UK to remember family, friends, neighbours and colleagues we have lost. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking Stoke City Council for supporting my call for a post-box to heaven in Carmountside Cemetery, and on the second anniversary of the tragic death of my constituent, 2-year-old Harper Lee Fanthorpe, who swallowed a button battery, will he thank her courageous mother, Stacey, for leading the campaign to raise awareness of the dangers of button batteries? And will he back my call for legislation to ensure greater product safety?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course I join my honourable friend in thanking Stoke City Council. I'm very sorry to hear of Harper Lee's tragic case, and my thoughts are with her friends and family, and particularly her mother Stacey. And we are aware of the concerns about button batteries. The law is very clear that products available in the UK must be safe. The Office for Product and Safety Standards has published guidance on exactly this for manufacturers and is working with the Child Accident Prevention Trust to educate parents and childcare professionals on button baton safety.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we remember the innocent lives lost 6 years ago in a terror attack on Westminster Bridge. Amongst those tragically killed was PC Keith Palmer, who sacrificed his life to protect others. Police officers up and down the country work tirelessly every day to keep us safe, and we thank them for that. But as we saw this week, those brave officers are being let down. Dame Louise Casey found institutional homophobia, misogyny and racism in the Metropolitan Police. I accept those findings in full. Does the Prime Minister?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I join with the honourable gentleman paying tribute to PC Palmer and indeed all the other police officers who have lost their lives serving and those who do so much to keep us safe. I was appalled, Mr. Speaker, to read the descriptions of the abhorrent cases of officers who have betrayed the public's trust and abused their powers. And let me be clear, it is and was unacceptable and should never have happened. We have taken a series of steps already, and the government will also now work with the Mayor and the Metropolitan Commissioner to ensure that culture, standards and behaviour all improve. At the heart of this matter are the people whose lives have been ruined by what has happened, and I know the whole House will agree with me that it is imperative that the Met works hard to regain the trust of the people it is privileged to serve.
Keir Starmer.
I take it from that answer that the Prime Minister does accept the Casey findings in full, including the institutional failures. Because nobody reading the Casey report can be left in any doubt about how serious this is, and doubt for a second that it's restricted to the Met. The report lays bare how those unfit to join the police are aided by patchwork vetting systems that leave the door open. If the government backed Labour's plan for proper mandatory national vetting, we could end the farce that sees different police recruitment standards in different forces. Will he back that plan so we can make speedy progress?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's no need to back that plan because we're already taking action to tackle the issues that are raised in the Casey report. And it was actually 2 months ago. It was 2 months ago that I met with Dame Louise Casey and the Metropolitan Commissioner, and we introduced a series of measures. For instance, the College of Policing is currently updating the statutory code of practice for police officer vetting that all forces legally have to follow. All police forces are in the process of checking their officers against the Police National Database, and in weeks, Her Majesty's Independent Inspectorate will report back on their re-inspection of all forces' vetting procedures. Now, these steps, of course, won't undo the terrible damage that have been previously committed, but we owe this action and more to the victims and survivors to ensure that such tragedies never happen again.
Keir Starmer.
Well, the problem with the Prime Minister's answer is what he's referring to isn't mandatory. How can it possibly be right to have different standards for recruitment in different police forces? No wonder the Casey report criticised what she calls the government's hands-off attitude to policing over the last 13 years. But let's call it what it really is, sheer negligence. The report also exposes chronic failures by the police to deal with rape cases, with officers using, and I quote, overstuffed or broken fridges containing the rape kits of victims. On his watch, rape charges are 1.6%. Yet the government still hasn't backed Labour's plan to have proper, high-quality rape and serious sexual offences units in every police force. Why not?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what Louise Casey also says is that primary public accountability of the Met sits with the Mayor of London. She described that relationship between the Mayor and the Met as, in her words, dysfunctional. But when it comes... So I hope when he stands up, he will also confirm to the House that he will take up these matters with the Labour Mayor of London so that he plays his part. But, Mr. Speaker, the way rape victims were treated by the criminal justice system wasn't good enough, and that's why the government published an ambitious rape review action plan. It's right that we've extended Operation Sorteria across all police forces in the country. We've tripled the number of independent sexual violence advisors. We've improved the process of collecting phone evidence and being cross-examined. And since 2010, we've quadrupled funding for victim support services. That is a Conservative government doing everything we can to support victims and tackle predators.
People are fed up to the back teeth with a government that never takes responsibility and just tries to blame everyone. They can shout if they're proud of the fact that over 98% of rapists are never put before. If they want to shout about that, that's their record. Let them shout about it. You should be ashamed of yourself. The truth is simple. After 13 years of Tory government, crime is out of control and people are paying the price. Before Christmas, the BBC reported the shocking case of a woman in Armthorpe who'd been beaten with a baseball bat by burglars 3 years ago. Nobody had been charged with that burglary, and she couldn't sleep at night. Under their watch, tragically, that's not an unusual case. So can the Prime Minister tell us what's the charge rate for theft and burglary across the country?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, actually, since 2019, neighbourhood crime is down by 25%. But he asked rightly about what's happening with rape cases. So let me just tell him that we are on track to meet our target of doubling the number of rape cases that are reaching our courts. Since the Rape Review Action Plan was published, we've seen police referrals double. We've seen charges double, and last year there was a 65% increase in rape convictions. Yes. But importantly, we also changed the law to ensure that rapists would spend more time in prison. But what did his shadow policing minister say? Prison doesn't prevent crime. It tells you everything that you need to know about the Labour Party. You can't trust them to keep Britain safe.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stands there and pretends that everything's fine. He is so totally out of touch. He needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and Mr. Speaker, I don't mean...
It's a big day today in the House, and it's a very important day. We do want to make progress. Holding us up is not advantageous to any of us.
Mr. Speaker, he needs to get out of Westminster, get out of Kensington, and I don't mean to Malibu, to the streets of Britain. Go there and tell people it's all fine and see what reaction he gets. The answer he didn't want to give, although he knows it, is 4% of cases, 4% of burglary charges are charged, 96% of theft and burglary cases not even going before the courts. Burglars twice as likely to get away with it now as they were a decade ago. They should be ashamed of that record. And that cul-de-sac in Armthorpe has apparently seen 10 burglaries in 18 months, but only one of them has resulted in a prosecution. So rather than boasting and blaming others, why doesn't he tell the country when he's going to get the theft and burglary charge rate back to where it was before they wrecked policing?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say North Yorkshire is a lot further away than North London.
Can I say, I'd like the lines as well, but I prefer to hear them rather than jeering. Come on, Prime Minister. Mister. Now then, we are going to make progress. Mr. Shelbrooke will be buying the teas in the tea room if we're not careful. Come on, Prime
Minister. There'll be Yorkshire teas, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, since the Conservatives came into power, crime is down 50%, Mr. Speaker. Violent crime down 40%. Burglary, the Honourable Gentleman mentioned burglary. Burglary down 56%. Why? Because we've recruited 20,000 more police officers. We've given them the powers to tackle crime, and we've kept serious offenders in prison for longer. All they've done is vote against greater protections for emergency workers. They've opposed tougher sentences for violent criminals, and they are failing to give the police the powers that they need. It's the same old Labour, soft on crime, soft on criminals.
The only criminal investigation he's ever been involved in is the one that found him guilty of breaking the law. I've prosecuted countless rapists. On the Prime Minister, I want tougher.
Hold on. I am determined to hear the questions, whether it's the Leader of the Opposition, the Prime Minister. So I can. Sorry. I think you've got your first customer for tea, Mr. Kurtz. We keep having this little problem. We'll have no more. No, then, just a moment. So please, let's get through and let's just show some respect to both people at dispatch boxes. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've prosecuted countless rapists and I support tougher sentences. But you have to catch the criminals first. And when 98% of rapists are not even being put before the court, that's a massive failure on the government. And if he wants to go to Armthorpe, which is in Yorkshire, why doesn't he go to that cul-de-sac when he gets out and about in Yorkshire and ask them about those 10 burglaries that haven't been prosecuted? The reality is, after 13 years of Tory government, they've done nothing on standards, neighbourhood policing has been shattered, and burglars and rapists walk the streets with impunity. It's the same every week from the Prime Minister, whether it's the cost of living crisis, crime running out of control, or the state of the NHS. Why is his answer always to tell this British people they've never had it so good?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me just address the issue the honourable gentleman raised, because I said at the time I respected the decision the police reached and I offered an unreserved apology. But for the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Speaker, at the moment that happened, there was a full investigation by a very senior civil servant. The findings of which confirmed that I had no advance knowledge about what had been planned, having arrived early for a meeting. But he doesn't need me to tell him that. He's probably spoken to the report's author much more frequently than I have.
Luke, the Prime Minister needs to answer the question. He doesn't need you to... I don't think we need any more. Let's keep it that way. Prime Minister.
Look, Mr. Speaker, we're getting on. We're halving inflation by paying 50% of people's energy bills and freezing fuel duty. We're cutting...
And it's the same for this side. Mr. Gwynne, I don't need any more from the backbenches here either. Can I just say, let's come... Mr. Fabricant, not again. I'm just quite seriously... Today's a very big day, some important decisions are going to be taken. So please, I want to get this House moving on. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're also cutting NHS waiting lists by resolving pay disputes and getting doctors back to work. And, Mr. Speaker, we're stopping the boats with a new bill to tackle illegal migration. That's a Conservative government delivering on the people's priorities.
Holly Mumby-Croft. Holly Mumby-Croft.
Can I thank my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for the efforts he has made to support the UK's steel industry? Can I tell him that we remain very concerned about job losses at British Steel in Scunthorpe? So will he today reassure my constituents in North Lincolnshire that we will never see the end of UK steelmaking under his watch?
Mr. Speaker, the UK steel industry can have no greater champion than my honourable friend. And I know that this must be a concerning time for British Steel employees, and we stand ready to work with her to support them. Now, she's right, industrial sectors, including steel, have been able to bid into competitive government funds worth £1 billion to help support them to cut emissions and become more energy efficient. And the government's recently announced British Industry Supercharger Fund can help boost competitiveness in UK's key energy-intensive industries. And I look forward to working with her to ensure a thriving steel industry in our United Kingdom.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to PC Palmer, who so tragically lost his life in defence of this Parliament and indeed what we all stand for, democracy. Mr. Speaker, what worries the Prime Minister most about Brexit right now? Is it the likely 4% hit to UK productivity, or is it 3 former Tory leaders planning to vote down his deal this afternoon?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the Windsor framework represents.
Just to help the chamber, just help everybody. I understand it's true, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Windsor framework represents a good deal for the people and families and businesses of Northern Ireland. It restores the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and ensures Northern Ireland's place in our precious union. But what I would say to him, I was more intrigued to see the words of his own party's president, who just this past week have described his own party as being, in their words, in a tremendous mess.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that whilst Westminster is once again consumed by the damage being caused by Brexit, the public at home are facing the biggest fall in living standards ever, the highest tax burden since the end of the Second World War, and inflation at 10.4%. When are the Conservative Party, and indeed the Labour Party, going to realise that Brexit can't work?
Mr. Speaker, the actions that this government is taking are ensuring that fully half of most families' energy bills are being supported by this government. We're also making sure that we're delivering for people with the cutting NHS waiting lists, and that's something that we're happy to work with the Scottish Government to learn and share best practice with them on. But we're also, Mr. Speaker, delivering on the people's #1 priority, which is to stop the boats and end illegal migration.
Tom Randall.
Mr. Speaker, the unemployment claimant rate has declined significantly over the last decade, but there are still vacancies to fill and specific groups to help. And on Monday, the Employment Minister and I visited Arnold Job Centre, where Kelsey and her team are welcoming local employers to speak directly to job seekers, and a dedicated 50-plus work coach is getting more from that bracket into work. So would my right honourable friend join me in congratulating the staff at Arnold and other job centres across the country on the proactive work that they're doing, and when time allows, would you come to visit Arnold Job Centre in person to see the great work they're doing?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend and join him in thanking all the staff at Arnold Job Centre for their hard work. I shall keep his kind invitation to visit in mind. He mentioned the over 50s, and he mentioned the over 50s, or as my right honourable friend the Chancellor described them, are more experienced workers, and he was right to focus on them, because together with the Work and Pension Secretary, we are putting in place a range of measures to help support them to return to and stay in the labour market, and that is something that not only will help us continue to bring inflation down, but will support those people to have healthy, productive, fulfilling lives.
Neil Hamby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK Government recently confirmed that Scotland generated and sent south 35 billion kilowatt hours of energy in 2021. That number will rise to 124 billion in less than 8 years' time. For this multi-billion-pound bounty, Scotland will see no revenue, no manufacturing or supply chain jobs. In our land of energy plenty, why should our people be cold and hungry and businesses failing as a result of his government's robbery? So what has the Prime Minister to say in defence of this naked exploitation of Scotland's people and its resources?
Mr. Speaker, actually, this government is a strong supporter of Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry. And actually, it's the economically illiterate policy of, I think, almost all opposition parties to prohibit any new exploration of fossil fuels in the North Sea, which would have us then pay billions of pounds to foreign energy companies and then ship that energy here with twice the carbon emissions. It is a completely absurd policy, Mr. Speaker, that's bad for our security, it's bad for our economy, and that's why we're better off with the Conservatives in charge.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The island has been getting a better deal in recent years, and I thank the Prime Minister for that, especially before he was a Prime Minister, when he was working with me in different roles when he was in government to make that happen, and I'm grateful. However, the island remains the only sizable island in the UK without a fixed link, separated from the mainland by sea, which does not receive a funding uplift to support local government services. And this injustice has been ongoing now for 50 years. And all the evidence, Mr. Speaker, shows that it costs more to provide local services on an island than on the mainland. Will the Prime Minister work with me and his ministers to overcome this injustice this year? Thank you.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaigning on behalf of his constituents. It was a pleasure to spend many happy childhood holidays on the island, and I enjoyed visiting him more recently there as well. The Isle of Wight Council will benefit from a 10% increase in their funding in cash terms for the next financial year, and have been awarded an additional £1 million in recognition of the unique circumstances of the island, as my honourable friend points out. But I will ensure that he does get a meeting with the Minister for Local Government to carry on the good work that he and I started and make sure that his local constituents get the support that they need.
Rem Stringer.
Mr. Speaker, we now know from the Telegraph's lockdown files that during COVID, at the very heart of government, science wasn't being followed and rational discourse had been abandoned. This had dire consequences for children's education, mortality rates amongst the elderly, the economy and access to the health service. Lessons must be learnt, Mr. Speaker, but we can't wait 10 years for the independent inquiry to tell us what we should do next time when the inevitable epidemic arrives. Will the Prime Minister agree to a short-term focused inquiry that can give us recommendations so that we do better next time?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as with any public inquiry, the process and timing of the inquiry stages are for the independent chair to decide. As Baroness Hallett has previously set out, she intends to gather written evidence throughout this year, with public hearings also starting this year. They held a preliminary hearing in February which covered pandemic preparedness and resilience, and they've set out dates for preliminary hearings into core political and administrative decision-making across the UK throughout this month. But most importantly, the honourable gentleman will recognise it is an independent inquiry, and it's for the independent chair to set the terms.
Jerome May.
Mr. Speaker, more than 1.5 million people living outside London stand to be impacted by the Mayor's new London-wide ultra-low emission zone. Labour and the Liberal Democrats, they're all for the ULEZ charge. They don't care about the cost of living crisis. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that the best way to protect commuters and small businesses from the spread of this unfair £12.50 a day tax is to vote Conservative on May the 4th?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And I think he also failed to mention that just this week we've seen Labour in Wales introduce more plans for further road charging as well, increasing cost pressures for public and businesses. And I'd urge the parties opposite to listen and stand up for the public and small businesses, just as the Conservatives do.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When my wee brother was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis 8 years ago, it's fair to say it turned our lives upside down. I'm incredibly proud of the man he is and all that he's achieved whilst living with this life-limiting condition. And my Livingston constituent, Stephen Sharp, manages local football team the Fulshay in Stonyburn. He has Crohn's disease and he lives with a stoma. And he's like many of our constituents up and down the UK, living with a life-limiting condition, trying to provide for their families whilst holding down jobs with a condition and disease that wreaks havoc on their body. So, Mr. Speaker, given 1 in 4 people wait more than a year for diagnosis, will the Prime Minister and indeed the House support the campaign to cut the crap and get diagnosed early for Crohn's and colitis? And would he meet with my constituent Stephen and I to look at what more can be done for awareness, research and funding?
Can I thank the honourable lady for her question and pay tribute to, I think, her brother and also Stephen for everything that they're doing to raise awareness of this issue. I'd be very happy to meet with her and Stephen. It is something that I am familiar with, and it is a very difficult condition for people to live with, and it's right that they get the support and attention that they deserve, and I look forward to that discussion with her.
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Jamie Scott spent 4 weeks in a coma and remains seriously disabled as a result of a COVID vaccination. He and his family continue to believe that mass vaccination is the right policy, but it must also surely be right to ensure that that tiny minority who are seriously injured as a result are properly compensated. In the absence of court cases, it's in no one's interests to litigate. The current limit on compensation is £120,000, even for very serious and lifelong injury, and anyone who is disabled by less than 60% gets nothing at all. That cannot be right. Will my right honourable friend look urgently at changing it?
Mr. Speaker, it is important to start by recognising the importance of vaccines in protecting us all, and not least the fantastic rollout of the COVID vaccines across the UK. But I am very sorry to hear about the case that my right honourable friend raises. In the extremely rare case of a potential injury from a vaccine covered by the scheme, a one-off payment can be awarded. This is not designed to be a compensation scheme, and it does not prevent the injured person in pursuing a legal compensation claim with the vaccine manufacturer. We are taking steps to reform vaccine damage payment schemes by modernising the operations and providing more timely outcomes. But of course, I'll be happy to talk to the honourable gentleman further about it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new inflation stats this morning show food inflation is at 18%, the highest in 45 years. Millions are living in food and fuel poverty because of this government's failures and political decisions to enable grotesque profiteering at the expense of our communities. How on earth can the Prime Minister claim his plan is working, or is it in his eyes? Is it a success that so many people are struggling with their weekly food shop?
Mr. Speaker, the figures that have been recently published showed that since 2010, there are 2 million fewer people living in poverty, thanks to the actions of this and previous Conservative governments. Of course, no one wants to see people struggling with week-to-week bills like food, which is why it's so imperative we stick to our economic plan. And as the OBR have said, we are on track to halve inflation by the end of this year. That is the most important thing we can do to ease the burden on people. And in the meantime, we have a range of programmes, whether that's free school meals or indeed the holiday activities and food programme, to provide support to the most vulnerable families who need our help.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 60 million to improve transport links from Wednesbury to the rest of Black Country, 4 million for Wednesbury High Street, and last week, the most important part of the budget, the £22.5 million to leaven up Tipton Town Centre. Mr. Speaker, this government has put a vote of confidence in my communities, one they've not had for nearly 50 years. Can I ask my right honourable friend, delivery is going to be absolutely key on these projects, because he can ensure, using his good office, that we absolutely get this delivered on time and realise the potential of my communities in Tipton and Wednesbury.
Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend for his tireless campaigning on behalf of his local communities. I'm delighted that we are investing across the West Midlands, but particularly in places like Wednesbury and Tipton. And again, we will work with him to ensure that those investments are indeed delivered, working with the local councils, Transport for West Midlands and the West Midland Combined Authority. Those investments are going to transform people's lives and spread opportunity in his area, and he deserves enormous credit for making that happen.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, households in Gateshead have seen their energy bills triple over the last 2 years. They've endured not just the energy unit price increase, but the daily electricity standing charges increase from an average of 22 pence in 2019 to 58 pence from next month, an increase of 155% in standing charges, over £200 per year. To many of my constituents, particularly those in low-income households, this seems like a company tax just for having the temerity to be connected to the network. And these schemes will continue long after energy support schemes have ended. So will the Prime Minister commit to ending the regressive increases in standing charges and instruct Ofgem to return them to 2019 levels, or even end them completely?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, thanks to the Chancellor, the Government is providing support to a typical household energy bill, around half of that bill over the winter, support that was extended in the budget and will be worth £1,500 to a typical family. But we went further, Mr. Speaker, for those most vulnerable families. As the Chancellor announced, we will be ending the discrepancy between unit charges for those on prepayment meters, something that many in this House have called for, and also providing generous cost of living payments worth £900 to the most vulnerable families.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, two of my constituents, George and Carol Ellis, are my guests here in the gallery today. Sadly, in 2021, their son died by suicide. George was a member of the Yorkshire Regiment and had become depressed following one of his comrades who had taken his own life. In memory of George, Adrian and Carol have set up a support group which marries up one veteran with another who is able to talk through and hopefully help them. The support group is called Get Emotions Out, after George. Would the Prime Minister join me in offering condolences to Adrian and Carol, and also his support for the work that they're now doing?
Can I join my honourable friend in sending my and the whole House's condolences to George's friends and family, and thank his parents for the brave work they are doing to raise awareness of veterans' mental health. Support is available for anyone experiencing suicidal thoughts, including from the Samaritans helpline. And thanks to the excellent work of my honourable friend, the Veterans Minister, we are working specifically to support veterans' mental health through Op Courage, which is a bespoke mental health and wellbeing service for veterans in the NHS, backed by considerable funding, which was increased in the recent budget, and that fully integrated service will be launched next month. But again, I pay tribute to George's parents for all the incredible work that they are doing.
Alison Thulis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Mariam Amiri, came to the UK from Afghanistan on a spousal visa back in 2016. The Home Office have just refused her renewal and advised she should return to Afghanistan. Mariam is an educator, due to start a university course in September. She's a valued community activist. She's a vocal opponent of the Taliban. She is married to a man who worked for British forces, and her family is currently being persecuted in Afghanistan. She's been trying to get them here since Afghanistan fell. Can the Prime Minister think of any barriers or hardships Mariam might face in returning to a country where there is not even any means of applying for a visa? And will he personally intervene, as the Immigration Minister is yet to reply to me, despite raising this 3 weeks ago?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, obviously it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on an individual's visa case, but I will ensure that the Honourable Lady gets a response from the Home Office with regard to that particular case.
Len Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister to pay tribute to and congratulate my constituent, Max Woozy, best known as the boy in the tent, whose 3-year adventure camping outside is drawing to a close. To date, he has raised over £750,000 for the excellent North Devon Hospice, and will my right honourable friend wish everyone taking part in his final adventure, a camping festival at Broomhill Estate, great success.
Can I join my honourable friend in paying tribute to Max and everyone else taking part in this fantastic initiative, and congratulate them on raising such a considerable sum of money for a very worthy local cause, and I look forward to hearing how the rest of it goes, but very well done.
Final question, Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the Treasury receives an additional £65 billion revenue from Scotland's oil and gas, they've only allocated £20 billion for carbon capture, but nothing for Scotland. They've cut the renewable energy budget by a third. They've only allocated £10 million for Scotland's world-leading tidal stream and failed to back pump storage hydro. But yet they want us to contribute our share towards the £35 billion Sizewell C nuclear power station. Isn't it the case that within the Union, Scotland is the energy, but Westminster takes the powers?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, not only are we supporting Scotland's North Sea oil and gas industry, we're also providing £20 billion of funding for further carbon capture and storage, and does want to work and provide clarity for Acorn regarding their future path. But also, I think the honourable gentleman raised the issue of tidal power, and I am pleased to tell him that actually that is now included in the contracts for difference allocations, and there's 40 megawatts of new tidal stream power by 4 projects across Scotland and Wales in the last year. That's this government delivering energy security across the United Kingdom.
Please, questions. Lane Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to raise a point of order regarding the honourable member for Twickenham's speech yesterday, in which she raised investment at one of my excellent North Devon schools. This was done without prior notification to myself or the school. And having spoken directly to the school and local education authority this morning, it does appear that the information presented was at best misleading, as the school has an extensive works programme planned to expand the school's capacity, and the timing of future works is being determined around the best interests of the pupils and the staff with professional advice, certainly not held up by a lack of funding. As a former teacher myself, I find it deeply disturbing that Liberal Democrat MPs are prepared to use schools outside their own constituencies as political pawns in this place. And Mr. Speaker, might you advise how best to correct the record and ensure there is no further repeat of this situation?
Could I just say something, lady? I presume she has let the honourable member know that she was going to raise this point of order. Can I say, well, I'm grateful for the honourable member for giving notice of a point of order. I assume, as I said, she's given notice, which she assures me have. What I would say is, as she knows, it's not that the chair is responsible for the accuracy of members' contributions in the chamber. If a member has made a mistake, I would encourage that member to correct the record at the earliest opportunity. But the honourable member has quite rightly put it on the record for us all to know the situation. Alison McGovern, point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for accepting the point of order. Just now, the Prime Minister, in response to a question about his pretence that living standards are getting better in this country, replied that he is halving inflation on the very day that we have found out that inflation is in fact rising. So could I ask you, Mr. Speaker, as you said on this important day for this House, could I ask you how the Prime Minister can correct the record?
As the honourable knows, and I know, she does know the answer to that. What I would say is she's actually put it on the record what the situation is. As you know, it's not a matter for the chair, but it is a matter for each individual to try and make sure the correct. Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you know, there will be a substantive piece of Northern Ireland business debated today about the Windsor framework, and the government has indicated that this is going to be an indicative indication how this Parliament feels about the entirety of the framework, even though it's just about one component of the framework. Given that it will be signed over on Friday by the Foreign Secretary, why has this House only allocated 90 minutes for a debate on this very important subject that will not give Northern Ireland members alone enough time to debate this, let alone the rest of this House? How can we fix this before Friday, Mr. Speaker?
As you know, I have no responsibility for the amount of time. That is done by the government, who own the order paper. I don't own the order paper. And obviously, I think he's down to speak, and I'm sure he wants to raise the points at that time. Right, no further points of order. We now come to presentation of Bill.
Thank you, Mr.
No problem. Jim McMahon.
Water Quality Sewage Discharge Bill.
Presentation. Second reading what day?
Friday, 21st of April, sir.
Friday the 21st of April. You're right, Jim. Right, we now come to the 10-minute rule bill. Natalie Alfie. Mr. Graham. Please, the member was standing to address me. And there's no use holding your hands up. Take notice of what's going on. It's totally unfair to the member. It's a 10-minute rule bill. Please wait. You are important, but not that important. Natalie Elfie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to amend Schedule 9 to the Equality Act 2010 to prohibit age discrimination by employers in relation to the provision of insurance or related financial services and for connected purposes. There are more workers working over the age of 65 than ever before. Nearly 1.5 million people, of whom around two-thirds, a million workers, are employed, contributing 32 million hours of work in an average week. There has been a rapid acceleration in the shape and scale of older working. Sectors in which older workers are most likely to be employed are some of those which are particularly important to our economy and our communities. Around a quarter of such older workers are employed in healthcare, social work and education. The car industry and technical sectors also employ high numbers of older workers. If we want people to have the option to work later in life, we have to give them the tools, support and legal protection that they can do so. That includes protecting workers from discrimination solely on the basis of age. Age discrimination, like any other form of discrimination, is humiliating, demeaning and damaging. Right now, provisions in Schedule 9 of the Equality Act, introduced in 2011, make it lawful to discriminate on the basis of age in relation to health and insurance employment benefits. Now let me explain why that is wrong. I have a constituent, Stephen, who is here in the public gallery today with his wife, Marcia. Stephen is a train driver with Eurotunnel and has been since the tunnel first opened 30 years ago. Stephen worked on the building of the tunnel itself. At the age of 66, his statutory pensionable age, he didn't get a birthday card from his bosses. He got a letter. The letter explained that while it wasn't possible to sack him on the grounds of age, Eurotunnel were terminating his health insurance, death in service, and income protection policy for long-term sickness and accidents. Now, Stephen is doing the same job at 66 that he did at 65, but now he does not get the same money's worth or terms and conditions in relation to his contract of employment. In simple terms, Stephen does not get equal pay and conditions to another younger worker simply by reason of age. If Stephen falls ill, he cannot get access to the same speedy private healthcare cover that other people working with the company can, and this includes in relation to a workplace injury. If, heaven forbid, he died, his wife, Marcia, would no longer have compensatory insurance through death in service benefits. However, he is doing exactly the same job as someone else. It's the same job he did before he reached retirement age that he is doing now, and for the same company. The attitude demonstrated by Eurotunnel seems to me to communicate to Stephen and the wider employment community in Kent that it thinks a person who is older is worth less. Yeah. Now, Stephen has made it clear to me that he loves working at Eurotunnel. He wants to carry on working at Eurotunnel, but he does, of course, feel let down. In Stephen's case, I have written to the Chief Executive of GetLink, the operators of Eurotunnel, to ask them to reconsider, not least in light of Stephen's long service and commitment to the company. Standing here today, they haven't as yet, although they have said they are discussing it with their insurers. We need to tackle this issue if people are to stay in the workplace longer. We should tackle it because it is simply unfair and wrong. It must be tackled here in this place by changing the law. Because, and I do want to be really clear about this, Eurotunnel is perfectly within their legal rights to act as they have done. It is entirely a matter for them whether or not they want to include all their workers fairly and equally, or discriminate against one who've reached retirement age. The bill that I'm seeking to introduce today seeks to put that right for every older worker in this country by changing the law on workplace benefits so that older people are treated on the same basis as any other part of their employment relationship. Mr. Speaker, there was a time when a pregnant woman had to quit her job and she just had to leave the workplace. Then she didn't have to lose her job. And then it was said that if women were given paid maternity leave, then women wouldn't get jobs if they were of childbearing age. There are those who claim this reform to end age discrimination would be costly to business, just as they used to say the same about women who went on maternity leave. Yet, as we know, employers found that retaining women in the workplace didn't just benefit mothers, it benefited the businesses themselves. Businesses who were able to retain the vital skills and knowledge of female workers. In the same way, older workers have skills and knowledge gained over many years in the workplace. Treating older workers fairly will encourage them to stay and benefit the companies that they work for. I remember a time when employers would say that a woman did not need to work, did not need to get the same bonuses as a man, that a woman didn't need to be offered overtime, because it was men who had the families to feed. We've outlawed that because equal pay at work is not about who is doing the work, it is about what the work is. And that applies every much to a younger worker as an older worker doing the same job. Another excuse given is that covering older people becomes more expensive for everyone. The premium for the company itself goes up. This is, of course, an absurd excuse, because applying that logic, would it be okay to exclude from employment benefits people who have heart conditions, cancer, bad backs, people with disabilities or chronic conditions? Of course not. We would say it was discriminatory and wrong, because it is. So unless we tackle age discrimination, we will continue to have a working environment where it's very difficult for people who are working in older age. Mr. Speaker, an example of why the law needs to change is sitting here today in the public gallery. Stephen Horn, a man whose blood, sweat and hard work helped to build one of the great wonders of our time, the tunnel under the English Channel from the UK to France. A working man treated worse, treated badly, solely by reason of his age. Stephen is my constituent, and I'm putting forward this bill because I don't think that Stephen should have been treated in this way. It's disgraceful and unacceptable, and neither should any other older worker. The support I've received from right across this House has given me real heart. This bill has received incredible cross-party support. I would like to thank my honourable friends for North Devon, Hastings and Rye, Southend West, Bly Valley, as well as the honourable members for Liverpool West Derby, Birmingham Selly Oak, and those on the face of the bill who I shall name shortly, and a number of others. We are at our very best in this place when we come together to address injustices and right wrongs. I very much hope that Stephen's Eurotunnel law will be a turning point for protecting older workers in the workplace in the years to come. I commend this bill to the House.
The honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Caroline Noakes, Dame Diana Johnson, David Linden, Jim Shannon, Bob Blackman, Rachel Maskell, Marion Fellows, Henry Smith, Tony Lloyd, Marco Longi, and myself.
Natalie Alfick.
Employment Equality, Insurance, etc. Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 24th November.
Friday, the 24th of November. Thank you. We now come to motion number 2 on the Northern Ireland. Minister to move.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the draft Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Regulations 2023, which were laid before the House on 20th of March, be approved. Before I start, Mr. Speaker, can I mention that it is my normal practice to take as many interventions as I possibly can during a debate. However, this debate is on a statutory instrument and therefore limited in time. So I will take interventions, but I won't take the normal number that I would. And I will try and mop up all the questions raised in the debate at the end with the leave of the House. The Stormont break is at the heart of the Westminster framework. It addresses the democratic deficit, restores the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and ends the prospect of dynamic alignment. It restores practical sovereignty to the United Kingdom as a whole and to the people of Northern Ireland in particular. I will give way to my...
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. As someone who served in the province during the Troubles and saw firsthand the pain and anger endured by all communities, does he agree with me that the Windsor Framework not only restores the balance of the Belfast Agreement, but also offers the province much greater prosperity by way of inward investment, and greater prosperity helps most situations?
I thank my honourable friend for his words, and yes, I do agree with him entirely. We are just coming up to the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which has built peace and stability across Northern Ireland. And I very much hope, as I do believe every single politician from Northern Ireland does, that the next 25 years of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, helped along by this Windsor Framework, will bring an age of prosperity to Northern Ireland like we've never seen before. I'll take 3 members. I'll go Mr. Shannon first.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank it's not often that I'm ahead of the other ones, but it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Secretary of State, we will have some difference of opinion in this. Does the Honourable Secretary of State understand our frustration on the Windsor Framework, or as we in unionism call it, the Windsor Nut? Is not a deal that enjoys or receives unionist support. Indeed, the United Kingdom gives the EU sovereignty over the courts and power over Northern Ireland. It has, I say this respectfully to the Secretary of State because I'm a respectful person, has been shoved through the House by the government. The Conservative and Unionist Party, with some dismay, I actually question now Conservative and where is the Unionist? In a format that doesn't allow for scrutiny or due processes. And on that point, Secretary of State, honourable members and others across this House should take note, and they should vote against this essay today, because it introduces a gravely important constitutional issue, and we're very concerned.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his words, which I fundamentally disagree with. I am a unionist. I'm very proud to be a unionist, and I believe that the foundations of this of our wonderful country make it, each of them make it stronger. And I do believe that this is a massive step forward in both progress for Northern Ireland, but the Union as well. I actually disagree with him entirely on his point. This actually adds to the democratic scrutiny that is available. And as one of Michel Barnier's former advisers put it, it does amount to a clear veto possibility for the UK government, directive by directive, at the behest of minority in the Northern Ireland Assembly. I think people who know what they're talking about understand that this is a very, very good deal. I'll happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving...
Who does the Secretary of State want? Help me.
Member for Caithness, please.
Jamie Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to say one thing to the right honourable gentleman, which is he talks about prosperity. But I have seed potato growers in my constituency telling me that this framework is very welcome indeed. It means that they can access the Northern Irish market and in turn, via mechanism, access the Republic of Ireland market. That is most welcome. That's about the prosperity of my constituency. And perhaps this may lead to access to the Spanish and French market, which could be useful in the future. So that's why I believe we should support the framework.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his very, very pro-unionist commentary. He's absolutely right. This for seed potatoes and for a whole host of other products that were no longer being, through the protocol, not available in Northern Ireland. the Windsor framework solves those issues and opens that market up. I happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful for the Secretary of State for giving way. I thought I was going to have to do a whole lot of squats there just to get in. One of the criteria for using the Starmer breaker for signing the petition says that MLAs using it must be individually and collectively seeking in good faith to fully operate the institutions, including through the nomination of ministers and support for the normal operation of the Assembly. Does this mean that Jim Allister will be excluded from signing that petition?
If the Assembly is sitting and he's sitting in it, which he would be as a fully elected member from his political party, then I'm absolutely sure he could sign said for the break. I believe there was one more person behind me.
Very grateful, Mr. Speaker. Could I commend the Prime Minister and my right honourable friend for the work that he's done? Does it not show that when you build bridges, when you show pragmatism, when you work with our continental colleagues, we can actually provide results? Does he also agree that along with AUKUS, along with the Paris Summit, and indeed the budget, this is now a return to statecraft that we want to see in number 10?
It is without doubt statecraft emanating from number 10, and I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for everything that he does in that way. I'm going to continue just for a bit, if I may. I will come back in a moment. But in a democracy, we all believe, as Democrats here, people should have a say over any change to the laws under which they live. But under the old protocol, that was not the case. Changes to laws were automatically imposed on Northern Ireland, whether it wanted them or not. And as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I, like many other members of this House, found this to be an unacceptable state of affairs. The Stormont break not only ends that, but ensures that changes to rules and regulations have the consent of both communities, asserting a fundamental principle of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. I will happily give way to this honourable gentleman here.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend who has made this progress hugely possible through his hard work. Does he agree with me that wherever you're starting from, by comparing the Northern Ireland Protocol with the Windsor Framework, it is quite clear to everyone that good progress has been made and that it is an improvement and that it is welcomed by most of the communities in Northern Ireland very strongly indeed, and for that reason we should be supporting it tonight.
I thank the honourable gentleman. Yes, I do believe that, and I thank him for his point. As the honourable lady, honourable gentleman, and then I will continue. And yes, of course.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and he's making a powerful case about democratic scrutiny. In that spirit, then, will he also confirm, in order to support the Windsor Agreement, that he will use his powers as a Secretary of State to retain all the existing EU law that will be deleted by the EU law bill by the end of this year, because the European Union has written to us today to warn that if he does not do that, this agreement will be in doubt. It's not to do with the Stormont broke, it is the existing legislation that will be deleted by the Sunset Clause. He has the power to retain it. Is he going to support this legislation?
I'm afraid I've not seen that letter. I know nothing of it, and I do believe that the retained EU law bill is going to do a good job of work for the whole of the United Kingdom. I'm going to give way to my honourable friend Farrelly. I'll take who's on their feet.
I thank the Secretary of State. I fear today we will respectfully have to agree to disagree. But he has described the break on multiple occasions, including in BBC interviews, as a veto. Given that if Stormont pulls it, UK ministers may still not exercise the break in exceptional circumstances, so it's down to ministerial fiat, and also given that even if they do, the EU can object and it's referred to independent arbitration where the UK could lose, that is a route to arbitration, isn't it? That is not a veto. Will he accept that?
One, it is a veto. Two, it is a route to arbitration. And three, it removes any element of the ECJ being relevant in this decision. So I think we've actually delivered on some of the things that the honourable gentleman and I have campaigned on over the years. Gentleman, over there.
I am grateful, in respect of grounds for seeking to apply the break, in response to a written question to the Foreign Office, the Parliamentary and the Secretary of State replied, as to exports to Northern Ireland through the ports of Holyhead, he said, the Green Lane is open to all UK businesses where they import or sell goods that are not ultimately destined for the EU market. This includes goods travelling from Wales to Northern Ireland in transit through the Republic of Ireland using the transit procedure. Can you confirm that this is indeed the case and elaborate now or by letter how that procedure will actually work?
State.
I thank you for his question, which I don't think I heard completely, but the Green Lane will be open for goods travelling into Northern Ireland for consumption in Northern Ireland. There is a red lane that is for goods that are going into the Republic itself. If I misheard the Honourable Gentleman's question, I'll write to him and clarify if that's okay. I'm going to give way to the Honourable Gentleman for
Grateful to the Secretary of State. Why do EU laws apply to businesses in Northern Ireland under this agreement that are not trading with the EU? How many EU laws apply, and why don't we see a list of them?
State.
It's less than 3%. It preserves access for Northern Ireland businesses to the single market, and as I detailed yesterday, I listed a whole host of the different areas by which EU laws are disapplied in Northern Ireland. I'm going to take two more interventions, one from the gentleman there and one from a former Secretary of State.
I'm extremely grateful to the Secretary of State. He's, of course, right to say that any political entity within a wider economic structure should have a say or some way of expressing his view in relation to the rules and regulations of that economic structure. With that in mind, will the British Government be bringing forward a saner than Holyrood break when it comes to the UK internal market?
I thought we already had it, but I shall come back to you on the agenda if that's not the case. To the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend just reconfirm that this stormont break stops and gives total control to the Assembly in Northern Ireland on any new EU law or regulation? And secondly, that this deal has made huge strides from seed potatoes to VAT to state aid to customs to all aspects of the protocol that we in this House have debated for so long.
I have to agree with my right honourable friend. And I think what I best should do now, Mr. Speaker, is continue with this so I can explain this all to the House, because the break is triggered if 30 members of the Legislative Assembly, in a moment if I may, from two parties object to an amending rule or regulation. These MLAs can be from the same community designation, so they can, in theory and in practice, come from two unionist parties or indeed two nationalist parties. The exercise of the break will require no other process and no vote in the Assembly. Once the break has been pulled, the law will automatically be disapplied in Northern Ireland after 2 weeks. The EU could only challenge the use of the break through international arbitration after the law had been suspended, where the bar to overturn it would be exceptionally high. The Stormont, in a moment, if I may. The Stormont break is one of the most significant changes that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has secured. It is a robust change that gives the United Kingdom a veto over dynamic alignment with EU rules. But just as importantly, Mr. Speaker, the regulations we are debating today put the democratically elected representatives of the people of Northern Ireland in the driving seat when it comes to whether and when that veto will be used. I'll happily give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Could he answer very clearly this one simple question? Isn't it the case that every single vehicle, a lorry vehicle, that will depart the port of Carnryan to Northern Ireland will have to have customs declaration papers for every product on that vehicle? And is it right that one vehicle travelling from one part of the United Kingdom to another part of the United Kingdom continues to be treated in that way?
Those vehicles will be using the Trusted Trader service. 21 fields of information, mostly auto-populated, which would mean no certificates needed from vets or from any third parties. I think the honourable gentleman, I'm afraid it is, I think I'm right, to the honourable gentleman. I'll happily give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. When he appeared before the European Scrutiny Committee yesterday, my right honourable friend promised to deliver the list of the 3% of the EU laws he says will remain as a consequence of this process. Can you please tell us where that list is?
And I did give that the majority of that list in the course of that program, and I did say I would write to the honourable gentleman, which I will do. Of course, Mr. Speaker, the old protocol did have some measures that were aimed at giving it democratic legitimacy. The UK did have a vote over any new laws that the EU wanted to add to the protocol, but that veto did not extend to amendments of laws that were already there. And crucially, there was no role for the Northern Ireland Assembly in deciding whether and when to use that veto. And of course, it contained the democratic consent mechanism, an important means of giving the Assembly the right to end the application of Articles 5 to 10 of the old protocol. Those measures were important, and the Windsor Framework maintains them, but they were not, in themselves, enough to address the democratic deficit.
Would my right honourable friend give way?
I'll happily give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I wonder if you can just clarify something for me. He's spoken about the Green Channel for goods movements from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. Is it the case, and this is a genuine question, as I understand it, the Northern Ireland economy produces about £77 billion worth of goods, of which £65 billion go to the rest of Great Britain. Is it not the case, though, that everything manufactured in Northern Ireland would have to meet EU standards, even if it's going to the rest of the UK?
Yes, it's perfectly clear that we are maintaining, it's basically 3% of EU law in Northern Ireland, which is the bare minimum to maintain Northern Ireland's access to the single market, which just about every business I've spoken to in Northern Ireland and have made representations is delighted to be maintaining. And indeed, I've been lobbied by individual members around from Northern Ireland to actually have this maintenance of access to both the UK market, the 5th largest economy in the world, and indeed the EU market for goods. I'll happily give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and I fully support what he's done here. I think the Prime Minister and the whole of the Northern Ireland team have done a great job. And does he agree with me that this Windsor Agreement enables a huge opportunity in Northern Ireland, not just to be a precious part of our United Kingdom, but also to be the target of enormous amounts of foreign direct investment coming into Northern Ireland, because it will have the advantage of being an integral part of the United Kingdom, but having open access to EU markets as well.
And in that, and by maintaining that 3% of EU law, she helps answer the question that my right honourable friend for Lichfield posed. As I say, there will be a binding statutory obligation in domestic law on ministers to pull the brake when a valid notification is provided by 30 MLAs. And actually, just to address these regulations will add a new democratic scrutiny schedule to the Northern Ireland Act 1998 to codify this break in domestic law. The UK government must, let me repeat that, Mr. Speaker, must notify the EU when a valid notification of the break has been provided by MLAs. This is an important new function for members of the Assembly. It's vital they exercise this new function with the right information and expertise. After consulting with Northern Ireland parties, these regulations provide for a standing committee of the Assembly to properly scrutinise the relevant rules. Mr. Speaker, I'll happily take it.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State giving way, and can I say I'm treating this vote today as a recognition of the wider package and voting for it with the government. On the issue of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee, this is new to the Assembly. It will require a lot of resources, as will the necessity of engaging with Brussels in terms of the development of new law from first principles. Will the Secretary of State have a conversation with the Assembly around the potential for new resources to make sure it can actually do its job fully in that regard?
I very much look forward to having that conversation with a fully functioning Assembly and Executive. Mr. Speaker, some have described this as a consultative role for MLAs. It is not. It's a robust power for MLAs to stop the application of amended EU rules, a power that neither the UK government nor the European Union can override, provided the conditions in the framework are met. Some have claimed, I'm going to keep going for a bit if I may please, some have claimed that the EU must have some means of blocking the break. These regulations demonstrate, Mr. Speaker, that this process is entirely one for the United Kingdom. The process is firmly and unambiguously within Strand 1 of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. There is no role for any institutions outside the United Kingdom, whether that be the EU or anyone else, to determine whether the brake is pulled. It will be a choice of the UK alone, its sovereign government, alongside elected MLAs, whether the brake is pulled. Some also claim, Mr. Speaker, that the government might simply ignore the brake. These regulations make clear that the government has no discretion here. MLAs cannot be ignored. Valid notifications of the break must be notified to the European Union. The government's actions the government's actions will be subject to all the normal public law principles that attach to decision making. And for the avoidance of doubt, the regulations are clear that the prospect of any remedial measures by the EU cannot be a relevant factor in the government's determination. Mr. Speaker, it is not enough to simply allow MLAs to temporarily halt the application of a rule, but then allow the United Kingdom government to simply override them when the Joint Committee decides whether the rule should be permanently disapplied. So these regulations go much further and provide a clear, robust directive role to determine whether the government should use its veto or not. Unless there is cross-community support in the Assembly, ministers will be legally prohibited from accepting an amended or new EU law which creates a regulatory border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, except in exceptional circumstances. And let me be clear, exceptional circumstances means just that. The threshold for that exception is unbelievably high, and a minister invoking exceptional circumstances must be able to defend that decision robustly and in line with normal public law principles. And what's more, a minister must account to Parliament where they have concluded that exceptional circumstances apply or where they consider that a measure would not create a regulatory border. This represents one of the strongest statutory constraints on the exercise of ministerial functions under a treaty ever codified in our domestic law. I happily give way.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Would he just confirm to the House, if there is no Starment, will there be a Starment break?
If there is, this break cannot even start to be a thing until Stormont goes back and the executive functions. I'm happy to give way to him. Oh, sorry.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Thank him for setting out the way this break will operate. Would he join me in urging those considering these proposals before the House today to note that this is something that for many years people said was impossible, an application to stop the ratchet of EU law and to keep Northern Ireland in the Union?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. I was told this would be an impossible ask as well. And throughout my time in the European Parliament, and indeed as chairman of an illustrious body of MPs in this place, I never thought this would be achievable, and yet this government has managed to achieve it. Finally, Mr. Speaker, as with any international agreement, if the EU has considered actually, before I go there, Mr. Speaker, these regulations could scarcely make things clearer. The overwhelming presumption is that unless the Assembly says yes, the government must say no. Finally, Mr. Speaker, and as with any international agreement, if the EU considers that the UK has improperly pulled the brake, it may choose to initiate a dispute. But we need to be clear that any dispute could only arise after the rules have been disapplied in Northern Ireland, and the resolution of that dispute would be for an arbitration panel. The European Court of Justice would have no role in resolving that dispute. Mr. Speaker, these regulations make the case for the functioning devolved institutions in Northern Ireland even more compelling. These measures will become operable only when the institutions are restored. Denying the people of Northern Ireland will not only deny them the basic right to an effective, stable government, but will also deny them the full democratic input into the laws that apply to Northern Ireland, and that denial cannot be justified. Mr. Speaker, these regulations give domestic legal effect to this democratic safeguard and restore the UK's sovereignty. We should consider carefully how we vote on this measure. Without this measure, Northern Ireland would continue to have full and automatic dynamic alignment with EU goods rules, with no say for the Northern Ireland Assembly and no veto on amending or replacing those measures. That is an intolerable situation, Mr. Speaker, and I urge all honourable and right honourable members to vote to end that full and automatic dynamic alignment. I therefore commend this order to the House and beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, I now call the Shadow Secretary of State, Peter Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, the leader of my party, said in January that any protocol deal struck between the UK government and the EU would by definition mean real progress in mitigating the problems caused by the original deal that they negotiated. He pledged that in these circumstances Labour would support such a deal. It is a pledge that we will be honouring today. So, whereas the government has once again been distracted by rebellion and infighting within their own party, thanks to the Labour Party, they can be sure that the national interests will be served today. Of course I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way because he actually makes a very important point here. For the last quarter century, the House has proceeded in relation to the peace process in Northern Ireland, and today is about the peace process. Let's be quite clear about that, on the basis of bipartisan or non-partisan politics. For that reason, my party will also be joining him and the government in the lobbies tonight.
I'm grateful for the right honourable gentleman's intervention and taking a similar position and coming to a similar view as the Labour Party. As a Scottish MP, I also want to express my sympathies with the incident which is unfolding in Edinburgh with a ship which is capsized and is injuring, we believe, 15 or more people. So our sympathies are with him and the people of Scotland today. The government has said that the vote today is the main vote on the Windsor Framework. It's the main vote that this House will get. My speech will focus on why Labour supports the deal overall, but I will also begin on the Stormont break itself, which is the subject of the regulations that this SI puts in place today. The democratic deficit was always one of the hardest parts of the protocol deal to reconcile. Of course, businesses and most people in Northern Ireland want to continue access to the European market as well as the internal market. But the cost of this access was having no say in the rules which had to be followed. The Stormont break will give representatives a say once devolved government is restored. It is impossible to argue that this is not an improvement on the current situation. 30 MLAs from two parties will be able to trigger the break. But I think just as important is the new committee in the Assembly that will scrutinise new laws and which will affect Northern Ireland. There are understandable concerns about how the break will work in practice, but the best way of stress testing this can only be done through experience, and you can only get the experience by restoring Stormont. Getting Northern Ireland's devolved government back up and running is what we all want to see. I know also it's what the DUP members want to see too. I want to state the obvious before going further. The economy in Northern Ireland has huge potential. The economy in Northern Ireland is doing well. The Prime Minister rather eloquently explained why during his last visit to Northern Ireland. He didn't need to, because everyone who lives there or runs a business already knows. But the challenges posed by the protocol go much deeper than the market access, and that's what needs most attention during this torturous period of renegotiation. And I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I think he was right to acknowledge that there were legitimate concerns that unionism had around the operation of the protocol. Would he agree with me, though, that anyone looking at this objectively would say that those have been addressed both by the EU and the UK government? But further to that, the fundamental point is that businesses in St Helens would give their right arms to have the opportunities that Northern Ireland has: logistics, medical, manufacturing and agriculture, to have access to those two markets.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend's intervention. I'm also pleased that he recognised the legitimate concerns that the DUP have. But yes, I think all of us right across the United Kingdom want to see devolved administration in Northern Ireland up and running. That's what the purpose of this whole torturous process has been, and hopefully we can get resolved soon. I give way to the honourable gentleman for vote.
So what is the point of rushing through a vote on this protocol when it is the protocol and the agreement behind it that prevents Stormont meeting, which means the protocol would never be used?
Well, he makes the argument for why you should have voted against the protocol in the first place. Yeah. We on this side did oppose the protocol when it was imposed. He voted for it. Now, there are lots of people on that side, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that I listen to with great interest, because they often contribute a lot of thoughtful insight into the way we debate. But let's just reflect on what the Right Honourable Member for Wokingham said in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, the promises that he made to this country. This all came from his website because I read it with great interest. 1, there will be more growth in the economy. 2, it'll rebuild our fisheries. 3, food will be cheaper. 4, our power will be cheaper. We will have fewer unhelpful regulations. Well, if that's the case, we wouldn't be here debating this today, would we? 6, we will get a US trade deal. And 7, our balance of payments will improve. There are many people who should be contributing to this debate in a thoughtful way. He, I'm afraid, is not one of them. The challenges posed by the protocol go much deeper than market access. And that's what's needed most attention during this tortuous process of renegotiation. The Unionist concerns were mostly twofold. Firstly, there were impediments to the flow of goods travelling across the Irish Sea. Some products and shipments were more affected than others, having a disruptive effect on supply chains and the ability of retailers to keep their stores stocked in a manner familiar to pre-protocol shoppers. This, of course, leads to the second source of concern, which is the existential impact that these impediments have to the free flow of goods within the United Kingdom and what that poses for unionism. I give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. Would the Honourable Member agree with me that the Government has made tremendous progress with this Windsor framework in terms of veterinary and sanitary and phytosanitary measures? And what has been achieved with the securing of human medicines long term and the direction of travel for securing veterinary medicines up until the grace period ends shows that what can be achieved through dialogue. And it really shows to us all that we should be strongly supporting this framework deal.
It does indeed show that negotiating and talking rather than rowing delivers more, but it also shows that you should think very carefully about what you vote for in the first place. Yeah. It is a right enshrined in treaty that anyone in Northern Ireland who wants to associate themselves as British should be able to do so without impediment. I understand this. Of course I do. If produce made in Sussex faced checks on the border with Hampshire, I would have something to say about it. And I've also asked myself this: if the protocol checks were taking place between Ireland and Northern Ireland instead of the Irish Sea, would nationalist communities be demanding action today? I believe they would. So demand for action is warranted. It is based on real concerns, not confected ones. So the mystery to me has always been why the government took so long to act. Why wait until devolved authorities had collapsed before seeming to care? By the time I was appointed to this job, the DUP had been voicing concerns about the protocol for well over 6 months. They were ignored. A month before I was appointed, the Right Honourable Member for the Lagan Valley had published an article calling for Article 16 to be triggered. It was met with silence. Then, in February, the Executive was collapsed, followed 4 months later by the Assembly. In all that time, there was no visits by the Prime Minister, no meetings with party leaders either in Northern Ireland or in Downing Street, not a single statement to this House. As a result of this neglect, and believe me, it is neglect, we are now faced with 2 problems. The first is solving the technical issues created as a direct result of the original protocol negotiated by that government and voted for by every single person sitting on those benches. That protocol, I remind the House, was created, negotiated and hailed as a great deal for Britain by this government at the time. And lest we forget, it was voted for by every single member on those benches, including those affiliated to the ERG faction. Secondly, that period of neglect created a political problem that this government is paying the price for right here today. Put simply, when the DUP were expressing their concerns over the protocol from within the devolved institutions, they were ignored by the government in Westminster. When they collapsed those institutions, they were rewarded with a prime ministerial visit and ultimately the renegotiation of the protocol. The message from government couldn't be clearer. The learned behaviour of dealing with this government is that if you act functionally within the devolved administration, you are ignored. Of course, but if you act outside of the administration, you are unignorable. Of course, in this period, the other Northern Ireland parties have been denied their place within the government as well, through no fault of their own. In just one moment. So, if you disrupt and act outside of the structures of government, you get all the attention in the world. You even get a Prime Minister travelling abroad on your behalf to renegotiate a deal we'd hitherto been told was unrenegotiable. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman from Stansted.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. It's not only neglect or ignorance. Does the Shadow Minister recognise that Tony Blair, the former leader of the Labour Party, said you can't move forward without unionist participation in this process, in this agreement, this framework? Bertie Ahern, also a former an instrument in the peace process, also said you can't ignore unionism. Does the Shadow Minister agree when it comes to moving forward, unionism cannot be ignored and our point of view has to be core to the whole issue of how we find a process to go forward?
I'm very grateful for his intervention, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have the exchange between us. And it gives me the opportunity to say that I can only speak for the Labour Party. I can speak for myself as a Shadow Secretary of State, and that is that his party and no party in Northern Ireland will ever be ignored by this party or a future Labour government. But also, as I'm about to explain, that you will be most rewarded and you will have most attention and have most agency in political life right across the United Kingdom from a position within the devolved authorities. So I do understand his point. Tony Blair and others were right, but these are all leaders who gave the attention to the DUP and every other party at the point at which they needed it. They didn't wait until devolution had collapsed before paying you and them and their parties the respect that they are owed and due. I will give way.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, to give the Shadow Minister some credit, he is excellent at articulating the problem. But what's his solution?
I'm very grateful because we'll be getting to it. And of course, he also well, it's interesting that members there want me to speed up, but they keep intervening. So I'll get through the speech if you allow me to get to it. But he makes the most blindingly obvious point here. My party will be voting in unanimity today. It is his party that is getting in the way of getting this across the line, because it is his party that is split over how to vote on the issue before us today. We're acting in the national interest. They are riven with division. So people like me aspire to government because we want to deliver positive change. But the DUP now have to ask themselves, because of the way they've been treated by this government, would a return to government mean relinquishing power? This inversion of the very principle of government, this absurdity, is a direct consequence of the manner in which Northern Ireland has been treated by this government and subsequent Conservative administrations over the last 13 years. And I want to be clear to members who represent communities in Northern Ireland in what they can expect from a future Labour government, to answer the point of the last intervention. So let me reassure them that we haven't forgotten the lessons of 25 years ago and the tough years following the peace deal. To me, those lessons are, first, that leadership matters. Tony Blair's first visit outside of London as Prime Minister was to Belfast. He visited 5 times in his first year as Premier. He didn't neglect Northern Ireland, and nor will my right honourable friend, the member for Holborn and St Pancras. Second, work towards a strong, trusting relationship with the Irish government. Because when our two countries work together closely, it eases the anxiety that some people in Northern Ireland feel regarding their Irish or British identities, as well as creating the conditions for economic progress across the island of Ireland. Third, we need to have the same ambition for Northern Ireland as we do for every other part of our union. I give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way, and I note what he's saying, and he's absolutely right. The agreement 25 years ago would not have been possible without the sacrifices and the statesmanship of so many others. But would he acknowledge that actually it was John Major and his government that started that process, and that this isn't a party political matter, this is something that this House should be proud of?
Firstly, I thank her for her time as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland as well. And I readily acknowledge that many, many people made peace possible in Northern Ireland 25 years ago. We in this House will have the opportunity to debate these issues in a general debate coming up. And there will be plenty of opportunity over in Belfast as dignitaries from across the world come in to celebrate the great achievement of that time. John Major, of course, laid the foundations, and I think at the time and subsequently, all Labour leaders, including Tony Blair at the time, paid great respect to the contribution that he made. If I start listing the names of everyone, then we'll be here for a very long time indeed. Third, we need to have the same ambition for Northern Ireland as we do for every other part of the Union. For example, it is not good enough to roll out home heating support months after citizens in every other part of the UK have received their support. Fourth, we should aspire to build respect among communities and be a voice for all communities here in Westminster. The last Labour government positioned the UK as an honest broker for all of Northern Ireland, and so will the next. And finally, Mr. Speaker, Labour will never give up on Northern Ireland, however insurmountable the challenges might seem. Those involved in the negotiations 25 years ago have plenty of stories of frustration and moments of hopelessness. But perseverance is rewarded. It was then and it will be again today and into the future. It always is in Northern Ireland. While this deal is not perfect, it is an improvement. So, the interests of Northern Ireland and the rest of our country, we will be voting for it today. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you very much. As you can see, there's a great deal of interest in this debate, so can I please ask people, when they do make their contributions, to make it short, please, so as many people can get in. Julian Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome the debate and the vote today, and the Windsor Framework has my full support. I also welcome the fact that the Labour Party, Lib Dem Party and almost the SNP, I think, are supporting the government and the Conservative Party today. Those of us who have followed this issue closely probably never expected to be here debating a renegotiation of the treaty itself. And it's testament to the Prime Minister's determination and that of the Secretary of State, the Foreign Secretary and others, that this focus, and through this focus, they've been able to achieve that. As someone also who's been slightly traumatised by Brexit votes over the years, I'm also delighted that this is the end chapter. And notwithstanding further improvements and changes, I think this chapter is one we're probably all delighted to be ending.
Notwithstanding what the Right Honourable Gentleman said, may I suggest that still this remains unfinished business as regards our leaving the European Union?
Some people never finish.
Mr Deputy Speaker, some things never change, but I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for his focus and continued monomaniacal focus on this issue. I want to also acknowledge the work done by honourable members in Northern Ireland. Although we'll be in different division lobbies today, I believe, the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley spoke powerfully about the democratic deficit and the need for cross-community safeguards, which are now at the heart of the Stormont break. As one of Michel Barnier's top advisers said, as the Secretary of State has just told us, there has actually been a big victory for the Democratic Unionist Party. The Honourable Member for Upper Barn worked harder than anybody else to finally fix the issue of seed potatoes for her farming constituents, and the Honourable Members for North Down, Foyle and South Belfast have all engaged closely with businesses, Northern Ireland enterprises, to find practical solutions. I believe that the huge progress has been achieved, and we now need to maximise the potential for Northern Ireland to become one of the most attractive places to invest in the UK. I want to finish briefly by talking about the Union. The greatest strength we have in securing Northern Ireland's place in the Union is the majority of people in Northern Ireland who support it. We must cherish, nurture and expand that support and consent at every opportunity. Recent polling has shown there is huge support across Northern Ireland, above 70%, for the Windsor Framework and for solving this issue, and particularly cross-community support for the access it provides to both the UK and EU markets. I believe if we can bank the wins in this deal and secure over time stable power sharing, then we can look forward to decades and decades of overwhelming support for Northern Ireland remaining an integral part of the United Kingdom.
And that was a 3-minute contribution from a former Secretary of State, so I'm sure if we can all follow that, we'll get a lot of people in. Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Perhaps I should begin by addressing the remarks made just there by the Right Honourable Member for Skipton and Ripon when he said that he thought the SNP was almost ready to support this. I can say to him he's almost right, because we will in fact be supporting this agreement. We welcome it and we will be voting in favour this evening. Certainly the mechanism as set out in the SI provides what looks at first glance like a reasonably effective means of scrutiny within Stormont, although I do have to say that in terms of its function as a brake, it's perhaps questionable whether or not that brake lever is actually connected to anything, and only time will tell. So, in terms of the good aspects, we welcome that at long last the UK Government has engaged constructively over a prolonged period with EU partners to come to an agreement which improves the protocol. We welcome that the protocol bill has been left abandoned as it always should have been, averting the prospect of a catastrophic series of tit-for-tat trade reactions over the protocol, which would have been disastrous for all parts of the UK. And the task now is for ministers to start repairing some of the damage that's been caused in the intervening period. Now, from our perspective in Scotland, this while it certainly restores access for Scottish producers to the Northern Irish market, it still leaves us deprived of equivalent access to the European single market. So in that respect, it's not my natural disposition to be a party pooper in any way, as I'm sure the House would agree, but this only serves to make an already poor situation slightly less bad. And there are a number of questions that still need to be asked about how the UK Government will continue to try and improve trade conditions for other devolved nations in the UK, whether the Government can provide clarity over how the Port of Cairn-Ryan will operate and what infrastructure is needed, whether cows and sheep being transported between Northern Ireland and Scotland can qualify for the Green Lane, and how the UK Government is in more broad terms going to tackle the food security crisis that affects us all. Now, occasionally in politics you'll get you're blessed with a rare flash of candour. We had one in the budget speech last week when the Chancellor said to great acclaim from these benches that independence is always better than dependence. But we also had it from the Prime Minister when he went across to Northern Ireland to sell, as he saw, the benefits of this deal. Now, I don't know if the Prime Minister thought that just because he was saying it in Northern Ireland that nobody would be able to hear what it was over in Great Britain, and particularly in Scotland, what he had to say, but he described Northern Ireland under this this framework as would be the world's most exciting economic zone because of access to both GB and EU markets. He also went on to say that this very special position made Northern Ireland an incredibly attractive place to invest. In fact, it was no less than the world's most exciting economic zone. And just to make sure that he doesn't feel left out, the Right Honourable Member for High Wycombe also said, what an extraordinary opportunity for Northern Ireland, dual access to both markets. Well, of course, this very special position is precisely what the entirety of the UK had prior to Brexit. Now, I certainly, Mr Deputy Speaker, do not grudge one iota those benefits for Northern Ireland. I just wonder why members opposite, whatever view they take on this, have been so utterly determined to deprive those benefits to the rest of us.
William Cash.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe in the real union of the United Kingdom and the sovereignty of its Parliament here at Westminster. Article 1 and 2 of the Protocol clearly state the principle of consent for Westminster, and the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom is fundamental. Consent and veto are different things. We have left the EU and we have passed Section 38, the guarantee of the sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament, and yet all laws passed before we left in relation to the single market still apply to and subjugate the people of Northern Ireland to the EU, but not to the rest of the UK. There is no such thing as Northern Ireland sovereignty. There is only constitutional Westminster sovereignty, and I'm afraid I do not recognise the expression practical sovereignty used by the Secretary of State in this debate and in the letter he wrote to the Joint Committee Chairman on statutory instruments of the 20th of March. Why should 2 million Northern Ireland citizens and voters for Westminster be treated differently from, say, the 2 million people from Birmingham, Liverpool or Manchester? Of course.
The Honourable Gentleman is making a powerful speech, and obviously he's a subject matter expert, and I know he has passionate views on this. But listening to him, the phrase that comes to mind is a German one, I'm afraid. It's pathologische Realitätsverweigerung. It means a pathological denial of reality. The simple fact is that the lived reality in Birmingham and Manchester is entirely different. We aren't against another national border. We don't need to have some form of alignment with a neighbour for the free movement of goods and services. There's not a situation where there's, for example, I think it's only a single milk processing plant on the island of Ireland. There has to be some sort of practical recognition of the difficulties in the lived reality.
Well, unfortunately, the heading of the statutory instrument we're discussing in this motion today says constitutional law. And I'm very sorry to have to say that what the Honourable Gentleman said, and some references to pathological something or other, I'm afraid makes absolutely no sense in relation to constitutional law, which is that we in this country operate a rule of law and a constitutional law which confers the sovereignty to Westminster Parliament, which includes the people of Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and Northern Ireland, and should do so equally. So since Brexit, Mr Deputy Speaker, over 640 laws, which we see each week in the European Scrutiny Committee, which I chair, have been passed already for Northern Ireland by the EU Council of Ministers behind closed doors in Brussels by majority vote without even a transcript. Can we imagine laws being passed in this country, in Westminster, without Hansard, without a transcript, and by majority vote? It's unthinkable. Of course I can.
Very grateful for the Honourable Member for giving way. Of course, I think, if memory serves me right, he did vote for the protocol that didn't have a Starmer break and had far more checks in it. Could he explain why he's voting against this?
Well, very simply, because we agreed that we were going to bring in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. I'll come on to that in a minute. That is the difference. That's what would have dealt with the situation. So we in the rest of the UK have left the EU and have been subjected to our own laws, not those of the EU, for the past as they were for the last 50 years. This, as I've said to the Right Honourable Gentleman, it remains unfinished business. Pre-Brexit single market legislation continues in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill dealt with the unacceptable imposition of EU laws, but this bill is now being disposed of, to my very grave concern, although it was passed in this House by a majority of 72 on third reading. And most of, I may say, of honourable members who are here today, on our side of the House anyway, voted for it. The Windsor Framework does not effectively disapply EU law as such in, for example, the customs regime, because this falls within the legal competence of the EU relating to goods. Indeed, if the UK purports to use its so-called veto in relation to this question of the Stormont break, the EU will be able to get round this sooner or later in respect to the green lanes and may invoke retaliatory measures. I'm afraid I'm not impressed by the expression exceptional circumstances. Words mean what you choose them to mean, said Humpty Dumpty. The question is who is to be master, that is all. And I believe firmly that that will be the European Union. In fact, one of my sadnesses about this whole business here today is that there really was a need for proper time to discuss, in consultation with the government, alternative legal arguments. There are papers that have been produced in the last 48 hours and over the last few weeks. There are blogs, there are commentaries by distinguished lawyers which quite clearly demonstrate that the arguments that are presented by the government are not those which are agreed by other eminent lawyers. And that's a point of law as well as a point of fact. And as to the question of democratic consent and the inadequacy of the Stormont break, I'm sure that this will be addressed by the DUP members today. This is as important to all of us as the main principle of the Union. The procedures have been rushed, and I simply cannot accept that it is right for a statutory instrument to be approved in this House today when there is not yet a legal decision in the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee until Friday, so we hear. Furthermore, I now hear that the House of Lords itself, which is part of the Joint Committee, is not going to consider this statutory instrument until Wednesday the 29th of March, which is after the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee sits. So the government, in seeking approval of this statutory instrument today, is not doing it in synchronisation with the House of Lords, and I find this manifestly unsatisfactory. I am deeply concerned, too, that these procedures are not following the criteria of Standing Order 151 of the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments. And I do think that the Chairman, if I may say with great respect, that the Chairman of the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments, who is a member of this House for Morden, should really be here today to explain their position. I was surprised to see a letter from the Secretary of State to the Chairman of that Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments, dated 20th of March, in which the Secretary of State, I certainly will.
I'd like to thank him for giving way. As one of the few members of this House who was born and raised in Northern Ireland, can I make it very clear that this is not about his correspondence, but about the future of the people of Northern Ireland, the vast majority of whom support the Windsor Framework. The business community support the Windsor Framework. They believe that this is a much better deal negotiated by the Prime Minister than they ever thought possible. The people of Northern Ireland, and indeed the people of the UK, need to move on and focus on more important things. Thank you.
Minutes now, and this is really very time limited. The debate has to finish at 21 minutes past 2.
I'm just about to conclude by saying that this is about the rule of law and it's about constitutional law as well as the very fair points that the Honourable Lady has just made. I don't doubt the importance to the stability of Northern Ireland. I've taken a great interest in these matters for many, many years, but I will insist that the constitutional position is not reflected by the arrangements in this Windsor Agreement. And I would simply make this as a final point. The proof of the pudding, Mr Deputy Speaker, will be in the eating.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I will try to be brief, but you will appreciate that there is a lot we would like to say today in very limited time. And these regulations which we are debating today, known to many as the Stormont break, but they do touch on many very important legal and political matters. And can I at the outset thank the Prime Minister, the Secretary of State and others for their continued engagement with my party, for the efforts that they have made, and though at this stage we may differ on our views in relation to the Windsor Framework, I'm not here to question the motivation of ministers in seeking to make improvements, but they must, and I hope will, continue to work with us and others to get the further improvements that we need to enable the restoration of devolved government in Northern Ireland. And to be clear, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to see the restoration of devolved government in Northern Ireland. My party is a party of devolution. We believe that delivering effective government for our people is the best way forward, working alongside this House and this Parliament. And that is where we want to get to. But we've got to get it right. And I echo the comments of the Honourable Member for Stone about the rush to bring this statutory instrument forward. I have written to the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments expressing my concern that we haven't had adequate time for scrutiny of this statutory instrument. But today the Government has indicated that we're not just dealing with the SI before us, but this today is also an indicative vote on the Windsor Framework itself. And therefore it's important that in my comments I reflect not just on what the Stormont break does, but where it fits in to that wider Windsor Framework. Fundamentally for us, Mr Deputy Speaker, the problem with the Northern Ireland Protocol is the continued application of EU law in Northern Ireland in circumstances where it covers all manufacturing of goods in Northern Ireland, regardless of whether those goods are being sold in the United Kingdom or sold to the European Union. And I repeat the statistics that I quoted earlier at Northern Ireland Questions. Of all goods manufactured in Northern Ireland, the vast majority of them, some £65 billion worth of goods out of 77 billion manufactured, are sold in the United Kingdom. And therefore the solution must be proportionate to the difficulty. And the difficulty is the EU's desire to protect its single market and to maintain an open border on the island of Ireland. But the price for that, Mr Deputy Speaker, cannot be that Northern Ireland businesses manufacturing goods for sale in the United Kingdom are inhibited in many ways from trading within their own market. And so I say to the Secretary of State that in relation to the Windsor Framework, whilst undoubtedly improvements have been made, we have not yet fully addressed this fundamental problem, which is the continued application of EU law for the manufacturing of all goods in Northern Ireland. And we believe the real solution here is similar to that which was proposed in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which is that where goods are being sold in the United Kingdom, staying in the United Kingdom law and standards apply. And where goods are being manufactured by Northern Ireland businesses for sale in the Republic of Ireland or any other EU member state, EU rules apply. And that's the solution we're looking for. And the Windsor Framework does not deliver that solution. I will give way to the...
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree that on the point he's made, or any other improvements or changes that needs to be made, the best way to influence now is for Stormont to return and for Stormont to be the centre of what I'm sure will be ongoing improves and iterations in this area?
6 months to improve that.
Well, I thank the right honourable gentleman, the former Secretary of State, for his continued interest in Northern Ireland. And I say to him simply this, that my ministers in the Democratic Unionist Party sat in Stormont for over a year after the protocol was implemented. And we pleaded with the government. As the right honourable member, the opposition spokesperson, reminded the House today, we pleaded with the government to intervene, to do something to help us with the difficulties that the protocol was creating, and the government did not act. And I had to take action, and it was our action that brought the EU back to the table. And yes, we have made progress as a result of that, but more is needed. What is the more that is needed? It is to deliver the pledge given by the government in the New Decade New Approach Agreement to protect Northern Ireland's place within the internal market of the United Kingdom. And whilst the Windsor Framework goes some way to doing that in relation to the movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, it does not deal, for example, with the real potential for divergence between laws that apply in Northern Ireland, EU laws, and laws that apply in Great Britain, UK laws, where the UK decides to change regulations that were formerly EU regulations. And there is a bill before this House that will fast-track and significantly broaden the number of UK laws that are going to be changed and where EU law is disapplied, and that creates the potential for divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. It harms our ability to trade with Great Britain. It harms the integrity of the internal market of the United Kingdom, and the Windsor Framework doesn't address that problem, and we need it addressed. So I say to the right honourable member, I want to see Stormont up and running, but we need the government to deliver the commitment it made when he was the Secretary of State to protect our place in the internal market of the United Kingdom. I give way.
Very grateful. And would you also agree that because the EU will have powers over things like VAT and state aids in Northern Ireland, it will also have powers on a drag-through basis over the whole United Kingdom? And doesn't the whole United Kingdom need a veto?
Well, I agree with the right honourable gentleman, and I say that that is why we need a solution that enables the United Kingdom government and this Parliament to regulate the entirety of the United Kingdom internal market. That is the solution. I am not saying that where Northern Ireland businesses trade with the EU standards and rules should not apply. I'm saying we can allow for that. But what I am not accepting is a situation where every business in my constituency must comply with EU rules, even if they don't sell a single widget to the European Union. And that is wrong, because it harms our place in the internal market of the United Kingdom. The Stormont Break seeks to address the democratic deficit that I have mentioned, and to an extent it provides a role for Stormont to pull that brake when changes to EU law are occurring. But note, it does not give us any ability to deal with existing EU law that impacts on all manufacturing in Northern Ireland, laws that have been applied without our consent. And therefore, to that extent, the brake cannot apply. It applies to amendments or to EU law or changes, new EU laws that are introduced. And I also note, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in the proposed arrangements, it is available to the EU to take retaliatory action in the event that the UK government applies a veto to a new EU law. Now, this is a matter of concern to us in Northern Ireland, because retaliatory action could come in a number of forms and could include the suspension of arrangements in the Green Lane, which would impact our ability to bring goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. So we need to be clear that it is wrong for the EU to be able to intervene at that level in the free flow of goods from one part of the United Kingdom to the other. And so I highlight that issue as a real matter of concern to us.
Just before you take this intervention, Sir Jeffrey, there is now 9 minutes, and also when you resume your seat, I'm introducing a 3-minute time limit to get as many people in, so please be cognisant of that.
I'm very grateful, Mr Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend will know of the exchange the Secretary of State and I had yesterday at the European Scrutiny Committee, and the invitation given to him to indicate that in Article 18 of the Stormont Break, exceptional circumstances would preclude a material consideration being the EU retaliatory action that he has so referred. The Secretary of State was quick yesterday to agree with the interpretation. Can I ask, through my right honourable friend, that the Secretary of State at least will consider reaffirming the commitment that he was given yesterday? It features in Article 14, it does not feature in Article 16, but just to be clear, retaliatory action would not allow, the threat of retaliatory action would not allow a Secretary of State to consider that as an exceptional circumstances when exercising a veto.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I welcomed what the Secretary of State said yesterday, that we must not allow the threat of EU retaliatory action to influence ministers in exercising their powers under the Stormont Break. I also welcome the clear commitment that the Prime Minister gave to me recently, that the application of this power, the Stormont Break, is entirely a matter for the United Kingdom. It is a Strand 1 issue under the terms of the Belfast Agreement, and does not involve a role for the Irish Government in relation to these matters, and that's a very important principle for us. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has also indicated to me that in this process the wishes of Stormont will be respected. But I have made clear that in exercising the Stormont Break, we are simply applying, in our terms, the possibility, the potential of a veto by the United Kingdom Government on one aspect of EU law. This does not deal with all of the problem, and that's the difficulty that we have. The continued application of EU law in Northern Ireland is what creates the problem for us in our ability to trade within the internal market of the United Kingdom. As I come to a conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think it is important that the Government of the United Kingdom takes stock of where we are now. I understand that the the Foreign Secretary is going to the joint committee of the UK-EU Joint Committee on Friday to sign off on the Windsor Framework, and that the indicative vote taken today in this House will be used as justification for doing so. But can I say to the Secretary of State, surely our shared objective here, as was espoused by the former Secretary of State earlier, is to see the political institutions in Northern Ireland restored.
Do it then.
And therefore, we need to continue engaging with the government to get this right. My party is committed to doing that. We are committed to continue working with the Secretary of State, working with the Prime Minister, and that has to be about delivering on the commitment given to protect Northern Ireland's place within the internal market of the United Kingdom. That where EU law is applied to facilitate cross-border trade, that it does not impede our ability to trade with the rest of our own country within the internal market of our own country. That is the bottom line for us. And until that is resolved, I can't commit to the government that we will restore the political institutions. It's what I want to do, but we need to get this right. I want Stormont restored on a sustainable basis, on a stable basis, where there is cross-community consent and consensus. That does not exist at the moment. And therefore, we need to see that consensus restored, Mr. Deputy Speaker. For our part, we will continue to work intensively to solve these issues, doing so in the knowledge that what has already been achieved has been because we were not prepared to accept the undermining of Northern Ireland's place within the Union of the United Kingdom, the economic union of the United Kingdom. That's what we stand for. That's what we will fight for. We want to get it right. We will work with the government to do that.
3-minute limit. Karen Bradley.
Very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Now, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will know that I rarely rise to speak in debates that he leads, not because I disagree with what he's doing, but I think it's important that predecessors do not comment too often on their successors' work. I know how hard the job of Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is, but I rise to stand today because I support wholeheartedly what he has achieved together with the Prime Minister, and I want to see this statutory instrument go through with an overwhelming majority of this House today. 2 weeks ago, the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly, which I co-chair, met in Belfast to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We met in the currently empty Assembly chamber of Stormont. We met with representatives from legislatures across the islands that make up the British Isles, and we reflected on the leadership that had been required in order to deliver that deal 25 years ago. Leadership that didn't take just a few weeks, leadership that took years and years, people making sacrifices, going above and beyond and being prepared to recognise that no deal is perfect. But the combination of getting to the result of that Belfast Good Friday Agreement for the people of Northern Ireland and the people across these islands was so significant that that sacrifice was worth making. Of course I give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Does she also agree that another great virtue of this agreement, which is much to be commended, is it enables us to resolve those issues in a way which does not lead us into breach of any of our international law obligations, as would have been the case had we proceeded with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill? That has got to be a win for the UK's reputation as well as for the people of Northern Ireland.
I agree wholeheartedly with my honourable friend. He speaks with great wisdom, as he always does. One of the things that was clear to me when I was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and did the job that he now does, is that leaving the European Union without a deal would have been devastating for Northern Ireland. It would have been devastating economically, and it would have been devastating for community cohesion. And that was why I wanted to find a way, when I was in the role and then subsequently, to make sure that there was a deal that we could all get behind. Now, we had a deal that saw the whole of the United Kingdom leave the EU together in exactly the same way. That deal wasn't acceptable. It wasn't acceptable to that side of the House, and it wasn't acceptable to many of my honourable and right honourable friends. I recognise and I acknowledge why that was the case. They felt it would have meant us being too close to the European Union, and I fully respect that. We then had a deal presented to us by the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip. Now, there were many faults with that deal, but I believed the Prime Minister when he said that he wanted me to vote for that deal, that it was important for the people of Northern Ireland. And I was prepared to do that, even though I knew that there would result in checks on goods on the Irish Sea, even though that was clear from that agreement. But I was prepared to do that because it's so important for Northern Ireland, and my Prime Minister asked me to vote for it. Now, we must remember that when the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was drawn up and the Northern Ireland Act was enacted, we and the United Kingdom and Ireland were both members of the EU. So that meant many of the issues did not have to be codified. We didn't have to set out what happened to goods travelling. We didn't have to set out rights, because those rights came from our joint, but both of us having membership of the EU. Leaving the EU means that some of these issues now need to be codified. They can only be done through negotiation. They can only be done by there being accommodation made on both sides. What the Prime Minister has come back with the Windsor Framework shows enormous accommodation actually from the EU side. The Stormont break is an absolutely extraordinary thing for the EU to agree to, and people around the world are looking at what we have achieved and congratulating our right honourable friend the Prime Minister for what he has achieved. So I say to this House, what is the alternative to the Windsor Framework? What is it we think we're going to get? There is nothing better on the table. This is a significant move forward, and I urge my honourable and right honourable friends to vote for it.
Hilary Benn. Very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. I must confess that when I read the Windsor Framework, I was surprised and pleasantly surprised, because as the Secretary of State told the House earlier, there are things in there I didn't think the negotiation would manage to achieve, and it's to the great credit of the negotiators. I would also say it is to the great credit of the DUP that they have achieved so much in this agreement. And the EU has had to move a long way. And I think it is a very sensible proposal, because leaving the European Union always confronted us with a choice about what to do about the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Apart from those who say, well, that's not my problem, leave it to the EU, everybody knew that some arrangement had to be put in place. The result was the protocol. It didn't work. The Windsor Framework, I think, provides a way forward. And the Stormont break, in particular, answers the point that I've heard members of the DUP make in this House about future EU legislation, because the break is available. The second point I want to make is to respond very directly to the point the Right Honourable Gentleman for Lagan Valley made about existing EU law that continues to apply in the European Union. Many of those bits of legislation have applied in the European Union, in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom for years. For years. Have they impacted on the ability of Northern Ireland businesses to trade with the rest of the United Kingdom? No, they have not. And they apply in Great Britain because of EU retained law. Now, the government has a choice when it decides which of those bits of retained law it wants to dispose of or change through the EU retained law bill, to what extent it wants to create divergence. I suspect that by the time we get to the end of this year, many of those pieces of legislation will still be applying in Great Britain, because divergence creates problems. It's the point that the former Prime Minister, who is in her place, made in one of her speeches shortly after the referendum. She said divergence results in us having to make a choice. And the final point I want to make is that it is very striking that businesses will take decisions for themselves. There was a recent example. The EU decided to reduce the amount of permitted arsenic in baby foods. Now, what did manufacturers in Britain do in response? They didn't wait for the government to say, well, we might or might not follow suit. They said, henceforth, we will, of course, produce baby foods matching the EU standard, because they want to continue to be able to sell their products. And ultimately, businesses will decide the standard that works for them. This is a very sensible measure. I congratulate the negotiators, and I really hope the House is going to vote for it.
Sir Geoffrey Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we must avoid the danger of hyperbole, and I hope I don't disappoint my honourable friends on the front bench by saying that I do not think we can characterise this as the last word that will ever be spoken on this subject. But it does represent material and real progress. And if I had seen 3 years ago, if my right honourable friend and I had seen in 2019 a similar flexibility on behalf of the European Union, history might have turned out rather differently. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has achieved considerable things with this agreement. No, it is not the last word. Yes, it is true that to any of those who prize the constitutional principles my honourable friend for Stone has spoken of, it will always leave a lasting sense of dissatisfaction that there are certain rules that apply in Northern Ireland that do not apply on the mainland of Great Britain. But Northern Ireland is a special case. It was already recognised to be a special case when the Good Friday Agreement was introduced, and when even then, by the British-Irish Agreement, the full and absolute sovereignty of the United Kingdom government was abridged by the arrangements that were put in place then in 1997. For those of us who are Unionists, there will always be an aspiration to an ever-increasing proximity between us. But the stage we have now reached is that this agreement represents a significant and major achievement by this government. It requires, compels, commands the assent of every member on this side of the House, I fully believe. For it is a serious and significant improvement on the protocol as it was agreed in 2019. And why would we not at least agree to an improvement, even if we say at the same time it is not the last and final word? And so, looking back through the last few years with a degree of regret, nostalgia even for those times perhaps, I commend most strongly to this House, urgently to this House, the virtues and merits of this important and real staging post on the pathway ultimately to what I hope will be a final settlement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In the very brief amount of time that I have, I'll make a number of short points. Look, we don't like the Stormont break for a number of reasons. I would never have agreed the Stormont break. I think it damages and clouds the investor proposition. It has no specific role for the Human Rights or Equality Commissions. The break can be pulled before the committee can even finish its work on scrutiny. And most importantly, I think it's a very bad idea, given the number of years I spent in Stormont, to give the DUP a veto over anything. I want to just say something as well, Mr. Speaker, about some of the people in this House who will go in and vote against this today. Former Prime Ministers, members of the ERG, all of whom supported the protocol that had no Stormont break in it, that had far more checks for businesses in it. They're more interested in internal Tory politics than they are in the wishes and interests of the people in Northern Ireland. And I would urge the DUP to learn the lesson of the past few years. The people you can trust, the people who want to work with you, are sitting right here. They're not over there on the backbenches of the Tory, Tory party. I will.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for giving way. I just want to say two things. The people that we trust are the people who elected us to stand for them. Secondly, the veto that was given to the DUP was given to the DUP by the people of Northern Ireland, as the honourable member will well know, who voted in a referendum for the Belfast Agreement, and that includes a veto for Unionists, and therefore when he decries that, he's decrying the agreement that his party supported.
Of course, the agreement that the right honourable member didn't support. But the reality is we will vote for this because it has been made very clear that this is a vote on the whole framework. And we've been through many a negotiation in the past. We know, we understand when the negotiation is done and a decision has to be made. And in every single negotiation, in every single agreement there have been parts of those agreements that we haven't liked, but we've had to stomach it for the greater good of the people of Northern Ireland. We see the unionist concerns. We see many of them, most of them addressed in this agreement, and we are prepared to make the decision on that basis. But let me make this very clear to this House. If the DUP still refuse to go into government after all of this, more and more people, I can guarantee you, will figure out that the best way to make the north of Ireland work is within a new Ireland. That is where this is going, and people should be very aware of that. The Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley, the Secretary of State and myself were all in the United States last week. We know that President Biden has appointed Joe Kennedy as an economic envoy to try to take full advantage of dual market access. We met investors, we met senior members of the US administration who want to help us bring jobs to places like Derry that have been left behind over many years. This is a huge opportunity. It is facing us, it is right in our face. Dual market access that people around this House would, as somebody said earlier, give their left arm to have for their own constituents. Why, oh why, despite some concerns, even that I have within all of that, why would you give that up? The most important thing to remember, though, Mr. Speaker, it's done. It's over. The negotiation is finished. The British Government, the European Union are moving forward, they're moving on, they're dealing with other issues. It's time now to deal with the crisis in our health service, which is at the point of collapse, to deal with the economic stagnation, to get into Stormont, to do the work on behalf of the people, and to come back together again and work the common ground. There is no other alternative.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am a passionate Brexiteer, and I still think our future outside of the European Union is the best possible thing for the United Kingdom. But above all else, I'm a passionate unionist, and it really does pain me, like my right honourable friend, the member for Skipton and Ripon, to see that here we are again having these same discussions that we had in the hung Parliament of 2017 to 19. But for so many of us now, we do believe the deal that's been struck by the Prime Minister with support from the front bench from other passionate Brexiteers, this is the best possible deal. And at any time over the last 7 years, if we'd been offered this deal as a United Kingdom as the way forward, we would have bitten their arms off. And it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, the greatest pity that the DUP, honourable members and right honourable members opposite are not going to support this deal today. It seems to me that this is a superb deal for people who live in Northern Ireland. And whilst I fully respect the views and the knowledge of my honourable friend, the member for Stone, I do think that the constitutional issue has to be taken as slightly, only very slightly different to the issue that faces us today. Today we're looking at a deal that really will work so much better for the people of Northern Ireland and for our union. And as my right honourable friend, the member for West Horwich and Devon says, this will not be, in all likelihood, the last we hear on this subject. But let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. Let's move forward as one United Kingdom and vote for this SI.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear what we're debating here today. We're debating a lock or a break, which is necessary because the government has allowed the EU to impose its law on part of the United Kingdom. And the result of that is that we now have a border between one part of the United Kingdom and the other part of the United Kingdom, a border which is going to be reinforced very shortly by the building of physical posts which will be used to monitor trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, where goods which are going into Northern Ireland purely for the consumption in Northern Ireland will be checked, 100% customs checks and 1 in 20 physical checks. And that can be varied, of course, by the EU. And what's the answer, government's answer to it? Well, unionists can make a protest about it, they can sign a petition of concern. By the way, a petition of concern, which if there's anything will destabilise the Northern Ireland Assembly, it's the constant use of the petition of concern, and the members behind me will confirm that. So, first of all, there's a limit on what can be done. And secondly, despite what the Secretary of State has said, that he would be bound to, in fact, he would have no option to, other than listen to the petition of concern from unions. There's a whole section in this bill which tells us grounds on which he can refuse to do it. And even when he does, if he does accept it, he then has to go to the Joint Committee and he has to exercise a veto which he knows will lead to material impacts for the United Kingdom. And that we can be absolutely sure. If it's a choice between disrupting relations with the EU, ironically, this Windsor framework is presented on the basis that it's to normalise relations with the EU. If that's the case, how likely is it that we're going to pick a fight with them over the implementation of some EU law in Northern Ireland? The truth is, this is not a Stormont break, it's a Stormont fake. It should be rejected by this House. It doesn't protect the Union, it doesn't protect democracy in Northern Ireland, and it will not get the Assembly back and running again.
Well done. 20 seconds, John Redwood.
The government should not put this to a vote now. This will not work. It cannot work as a break because Stormont will not meet because of it. And it gives amazing powers to the European Union.
Order. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. The question is the motion related to the division. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No! Tellers for the ayes, Andrew Stevenson and Steve Double. For the noes, Ian Paisley and Paul Gervin. Order.
The ayes to the right, 515. The noes to the left, 29.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Ayes to the right, 515. The noes to the left, 29. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Sorry, thank you. All right, Nigel. Order. Order.
Consideration of Lord's message. Now.
We will begin with the government motion to disagree with the Lord's Amendments 6B, 6C, 6D, 6E and 6F. And I call the Minister to move the motion to disagree. Chris Phil.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Public Order Bill is about giving the police the tools they need to tackle the highly disruptive protest tactics we have seen in recent months, which have blocked ambulances, delayed passengers from making important journeys, stopped children getting to school and prevented patients from receiving critical medical care. We have seen our capital city, London, being held to ransom. It cannot be right that a selfish minority committed to causing as much disruption as possible continue to get away with it. These actions are not only impacting the public, but are diverting the police away from the communities they serve. I think in November last year alone, October and November, something like 10,000 hours of Metropolitan Police time were taken up. And that is why this bill is so important. Mr Speaker, we've had some back and forward with the other place, but there is only now one remaining issue to resolve between us, and that is concerning the power to stop and search without suspicion, which has been extended through this bill to enable the police to search for and seize articles related to protest activities. It is worth saying that this power, before it can be exercised, requires a police officer of the rank of inspector or above to have a reasonable belief that a number of offences may be committed in the area concerned. It further requires that officer to believe that the conditions being imposed, the authority to carry out these searches, are necessary to prevent the commission of offences, and moreover, the power only lasts for 24 hours, capable of extension for another 24 at the most. So it's a power only to be used where it is reasonably suspected an offence may be committed, only where it is believed to be necessary, and only for a time-limited period. So those are quite important restrictions on the way this power can be used. Stop and search is a vital tool that's used to crack down on crime and protect communities, and we see it as appropriate in the face of large, fast-paced environments where it can be difficult for the police to reach the level of suspicion required for a suspicion-led stop and search, for them to have this power available as well. Yes, of course.
I'm old enough, Mr Deputy Speaker, to remember when the policeman used it as initiative, as intuition, to suspect that a crime was probable or could be caused or had been caused. Does the Minister feel that this legislation he's referring to ensures that the policeman still can use his initiative to ensure that those who are carrying out crimes can be detained with the suspicion of cause rather than without evidence?
Well, I think my honourable friend makes the member for Strangford makes a very good point. Police often will suspect crimes may be committed, but in a particular case of an individual, may not reach the individual suspicion level, and it's in those circumstances these rules will apply. So I do completely agree with the point my honourable friend made just a moment ago. I do also want to be clear with members. Yes, of course.
If you could confirm as an illustration that the police may use this power, for example, if a demonstration is about to take place by a group who use a particular tactic. So, for example, gluing themselves to the road to intercept individuals with glue in their pockets before they then go and do what is then an activity or by gluing themselves, occupies enormous amounts of police time, puts themselves often in danger and put police officers in danger, and causes enormous inconvenience. That in those circumstances, the police would be able to use this power to get ahead of the problem.
I think the way my honourable friend puts it is very good. It is exactly circumstances where the police are concerned that a crime, one of the specified crimes, may be committed, that they can use this power. Those crimes are specified in subsection 1 of the relevant clause, and they include offences under section 137 of the Highways Act, that's obstructing the highway, or willfully obstructing the highway, I should say, section 78 of the relatively new PCSC Act, which is recklessly or intentionally causing a public nuisance, and various offences under this bill, which include causing serious disruption by tunnelling, being present in a tunnel, obstructing major transport works, and interfering with critical national infrastructure, as well as locking on, which I think is the point my right honourable friend was making. Yes, of course, I'll give way.
Last time we had this debate, but he mentioned the crime of nuisance, and the threshold for that is incredibly low. So you could have an inspector concerned that there's a chance that somebody will commit this offence by being seriously annoying or inconveniencing somebody, and then you let loose suspicionless stop and search of hundreds, potentially thousands of people for no further reason than that. That's a ludicrously low threshold for triggering these search powers, is it not, Mr Deputy Speaker?
I'm not sure I entirely agree, because I think the intentionally or recklessly causing public nuisance, as set out in section 78 of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022, I don't accept the characterisation of that offence as simply a minor one. I think causing huge inconvenience to fellow members of the public, or other members of the public, is not something that I think this House should treat lightly, particularly as we've seen examples in recent protests of ambulances not getting through. We've seen examples of people unable to get their children to school, people unable to get to medical appointments. So I'm not sure I do accept that characterisation. Now, turning to the amendments made in the other place, Mr Deputy Speaker, there's a number of changes proposed in Lord's Amendments 6B to 6F inclusive, which we're debating this afternoon. They firstly propose a higher level of authorisation for suspicionless searches. And by the way, the Lords, the other place, are not disputing the principle. They're simply seeking to change some of the thresholds, one of which is changing the authority level in a way that would in fact be inconsistent with the use of Section 60 searches in other contexts. Furthermore, another of the changes relates to the time periods. And as the Noble Lord Hogan Howe, of course the former Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, pointed out, the use of the power has to be practical, and reducing the time threshold to just 12 hours will limit the ability of police forces to use these powers in a meaningful way. And I do think we should take seriously the opinion of that Noble Lord who used to be the Commissioner of the Met. Secondly, the changes proposed in the other place would require that a Chief Superintendent provide authorisation for this matter when an inspector is acceptable under the existing Section 60 legislation, which I think overlooks the urgency and speed at which these protests can unfold, and therefore the speed at which decisions need to be made. I think it also has the potential to cause confusion if we have a different level of seniority here by comparison to the well-established Section 60 legislation. Finally, the amendments proposed in the other place would set out in statute a requirement for the forces to communicate the geographical extent of an order. The government does recognise that communication of any power is important for understanding and transparency. I am aware that most forces do already communicate their Section 60 authorisations. I've certainly seen that happen frequently in Croydon, and it's gratefully received when it happens. But it is, I think, important to keep these new powers as close as we can to the existing legislation for consistency, but I would like to make it clear that the government does encourage forces to communicate any use of this power in the same way they already do for a Section 60 order, where it is operationally beneficial to do so. I do think consistency does have a lot to be said for it, and that is why I would respectfully encourage members of this House to gently and politely disagree with the Lords at the other place in their amendments 6B to 6F.
question is that this House disagrees with the Lords in their amendments 6B, 6C, 6D, 6E and 6F. Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Government's tabled a motion to disagree with Lord's Amendment 6B to 6F to Clause 11. Stop and search is a crucial tool, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we all agree. And its normal usage is based on intelligence around a crime or a potential crime, be based on proper suspicion and applied for the right reasons. And in our country, we use stop and search with suspicion to look for weapons, drugs and stolen property. Under particular circumstances, we use suspicionless stop and search, section 60 as we call it, to search people without suspicion when a weapon has been used or where there is a good reason to believe there will be a serious violence incident. This government is introducing suspicionless stop and search for potential protests, an overreach of the law that the police haven't asked for and which pushes the balance of rights and responsibilities away from the British public. Yesterday, we debated Baroness Casey's report into the Metropolitan Police. It is an excoriating report that, among much else, calls for a fundamental reset in how stop and search is used in London. I was pleased to hear the Prime Minister accept all the findings and recommendations from the report today. The report says racial disparity continues in stop and search in London. This has been repeatedly confirmed in reports and research, and our review corroborates those findings. It's ironic, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the day after this report was published, the Government is trying to pass laws that risk further damaging the relationship between the police and the public by significantly expanding stop and search powers way beyond sensible limits. I will give way.
He says that these measures may damage relations with the public. Well, obviously, the vast majority of the public feel very strongly about the fact their lives have been severely impacted by these protests, and giving the police the tools to get ahead of them may in fact command widespread